Empires rise, flare into brilliance, and fade, yet their echoes shape the world we live in. In southern Mesopotamia, cities like Uruk emerged over 5,000 years ago, where writing on clay first tracked grain and law, turning survival into civilization. Along the Nile, Egyptians stacked limestone blocks at Giza around 2580 to 2560 BCE, engineering monuments that still outlast kings, calendars, and storms. In Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1754 BCE, spelled out rules in stone, proving that power endures when it is written, remembered, and enforced. Across the Aegean, the Greeks argued in assemblies and defended their poli, while ideas about citizenship, philosophy, and strategy outlived the men who spoke them. Alexander swept east between 334 and 323 BCE, stitching cultures together with roads, cities, and libraries before his empire fractured the moment the hand that held it vanished. Rome reorganized the known world. Legions, law, and concrete bound a continent from 27 BCE until the Western Empire fell in 476 CE, proof that even blueprints of order can crack. From the steppe, the Mongols under Genghis Khan united tribes in 1206, and within decades rode from the Pacific to the edge of Europe, turning speed and discipline into sovereignty. The Ottomans took Constantinople in 1453, bridging continents for centuries through janissaries, trade, and administration before the empire dissolved in 1922. By the early 1900s, the British Empire spanned the globe, its ships, telegraphs, and markets tying distant shores together, until resistance, cost, and war unraveled the fabric. Different peoples, different gods, different flags, and yet the same pattern: vision, expansion, administration, strain, and decline. Tonight we will trace that single thread through time, how empires rise on ideas and institutions and fall under weight they can no longer bear. If you're ready for calm, fact-based storytelling without myths or hype, settle in. Subscribe to Sleeping History, tap the bell, and leave a comment telling us which empire you want explored first. Your choice may shape the next episode. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, today largely Iraq and parts of Syria, people shaped water into civilization. Here, in the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, villages became towns, towns became cities, and cities pioneered the habits of organized life: writing, law, taxation, and long-distance trade. Farming on this flat, dry plain demanded cooperation. Seasonal floods were unpredictable, so early communities dug canals, built levees, and coordinated irrigation schedules. That management required records: who delivered grain, who owed labor, how much water each field received. Necessity pushed innovation. Administration made survival repeatable. By the late 4th millennium BCE, in the period scholars call Uruk, roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE, the city of Uruk swelled behind massive walls. Within its sacred precincts, the Aeana complex rose, a cluster of temples where offerings, storage jars, and ledgers turned devotion and accounting into one system. Priests and officials oversaw granaries, rations, and labor teams. To track it all, they pressed a sharpened reed into wet clay. At first, simple tokens and impressions counted goods. Then came proto-cuneiform, pictographic signs representing numbers and commodities, evolving toward abstract signs and syllables. Around the late 4th to early 3rd millennium BCE, writing ceased to be an experiment and became a system. With writing came an explosion of possibilities: ration lists for workers, deliveries to temples, land transfers, and later myths and royal inscriptions. Scribes trained in tablet schools, the eduba, copying sign lists and exercises until wet clay felt as fluent as speech. Writing began as accounting, but it soon taught people how to think in categories, laws, and histories. Mesopotamian cities were political experiments. Some were ruled by temple elites and city councils, others by a king, an ensi or lugal, claiming divine mandate to keep order and uphold justice. Power was not just military, it was administrative brilliance, the ability to mobilize workers for canals, walls, and temples, and to ensure grain moved from field to storeroom to bread. The early dynastic period, about 2900 to 2350 BCE, was a patchwork of rival city-states: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish. They fought over water rights and prestige, yet shared a cultural language, scribal practice, gods, artistic styles, and law. Even conflict forged common ground: treaties, boundary stones, and written oaths to keep the peace, at least for a time. Innovation never stood still. Mesopotamians improved the plow, harnessed draft animals, and used the wheel on carts and potter's wheels. Each advance rippled through society, multiplying the reach of human hands. Their mathematics still shapes daily life. Using a sexagesimal, base 60 system, they divided the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes, conventions we still rely on. They tracked planetary motions and cataloged eclipses, not to do science as we define it, but to read patterns and manage ritual calendars. Precision was practical power. Not all change was gentle. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad unified many Sumerian cities under the Akkadian Empire. Royal inscriptions celebrate him as a conqueror who extended rule from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean. His grandson, Naram-Sin, took the title King of the Four Quarters, expressing universal sovereignty. The empire brought scale, standardized administration, imperial roads, and multilingual governance. Yet scale brought strain. After the Akkadian zenith, internal pressures and outside incursions weakened control. Power fragmented, cities reclaimed autonomy. The lesson would repeat across millennia. Expansion is glorious until logistics, loyalty, and climate turn against it. A remarkable resurgence followed in the so-called Ur-III period, roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE, sometimes called the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance. King Ur-Nammu of Ur sponsored the Great Ziggurat and issued one of the earliest known law codes. His son Shulgi reorganized bureaucracy, measuring fields, standardizing rations, and tracking workers with a zeal modern managers would recognize. Law codes became a Mesopotamian hallmark. After Ur-Nammu came Lipit Ishtar of Isin, later the laws of Eshnunna, and in Babylon the famous Code of Hammurabi around the 18th century BCE. These were not constitutions in our sense, but royal declarations of justice, fixing prices and wages, setting penalties, and asserting that the king's role was to protect the weak from the strong. Everyday life was structured but not impersonal. Households baked bread from barley, brewed beer, and tended date palms. Artisans carved cylinder seals, tiny, intricate rollers that left signatures in clay. Traders moved along rivers and overland routes, using standardized weights and measures and silver as a medium of account. Temples and palaces served as both spiritual and economic hubs. Mesopotamia was no island. Merchants connected with Dilmun, often associated with Bahrain, Magan in Oman, and faraway Meluha, likely the Indus Valley civilization. They exchanged textiles, grain, and oils for copper, timber, and exotic goods. Letters on clay tablets requested safe passage and settled accounts. The rivers tied farms to warehouses, and canals tied cities to the sea. Religion framed purpose. The heavens housed a crowded pantheon: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna after Ishtar, later Marduk of Babylon, each linked to cities and cosmic roles. Ziggurats, stepped temple mountains, rose above skylines, their summits imagined as meeting points between gods and humans. Festivals renewed royal legitimacy. Rituals sought harmony between the city and the cosmos. Their literature speaks with a living voice. The Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled from older stories and reaching its standard Babylonian form in the late 2nd to early 1st millennium BCE, follows a king of Uruk who confronts friendship, loss, and the limits of human life. It is not a myth to memorize, it is a mirror held up to power, asking what endures when monuments crack. Mesopotamians also wrote letters, proverbs, hymns, school texts, and omen compendia. A scribe could copy a hymn in Sumerian in the morning and draft a contract in Akkadian after lunch. Bilingual training preserved older traditions even as new empires rose. Clay, with its durability, made their memory stubborn. Thousands of tablets survive to be read today. Geography both blessed and burdened the land. Irrigation fed cities, but over-irrigation brought salinization, gradually reducing wheat yields and favoring salt-tolerant barley. Managing soils became as important as managing armies. Environmental limits weren't collapse events on their own, but they nudged rulers toward reform or failure, depending on foresight. In the early 2nd millennium BCE, Babylon emerged as a formidable power. Hammurabi ruled roughly the 18th century BCE and forged alliances, then turned them to conquest, classic statecraft. His famous stele depicts the king receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god of justice. The message was unmistakable. Law was divine gift, royal duty, and social glue. North, in Assyria, cities like Ashur and Nineveh thrived on trade and strategic location. Across centuries, Assyria waxed and waned, but its administrative habits, record-keeping, provincial governance, and logistics would later power imperial dominance. Mesopotamia's toolbox was portable. Whoever mastered it could scale authority. Economic life left dense paper trails, really clay trails. Tablets record barley rations to workers, deliveries of wool, and loans secured with collateral.
Women appear as landowners, priestesses, tavern keepers, and creditors in some periods. These roles varied by city and century, but the documents show social complexity beyond palaces and temples. Timekeeping joined counting as a civic art. Priests and scholars timed rituals to lunar cycles, tracked eclipses, and organized intercalary months to keep calendars aligned with seasons. Their sky-watching served agriculture and piety, yet it also trained generations to see patterns, predict outcomes, and correct errors, the habits of long administration. The city was the engine of identity. High brick walls, monumental gates, and processional ways signaled belonging. Within, neighborhoods clustered by craft, markets hummed, courts arbitrated disputes. Outside the walls stretched the lifelines, canals, fields, and flocks. The city-state linked fields to temple, worker to God, present to tradition. Not everything in our modern imagination belongs here. For example, a global, single Sumerian empire never ruled all of Mesopotamia in the earliest periods. Political unity came later under Akkad and in phases under Ur III and Babylon. Likewise, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, while celebrated in later tradition, remain unconfirmed in contemporary Babylonian records and may have been elsewhere. The authentic story is already impressive without embroidery. The legacy of Mesopotamia is not just firsts, first cities, first writing, early law codes. It is the idea that complexity can be managed, that water can be scheduled, labor organized, accounts balanced, and justice proclaimed. Where others saw floods and droughts, Mesopotamians saw variables to plan for. Clay tablets were their spreadsheets, and canals their infrastructure. Even decline had a method. When rulers lost control of canals or failed to protect trade, or demanded more labor than households could spare, trust eroded. Cities rebelled, neighbors invaded, archives fell silent. Yet the system was resilient. New dynasties revived the tools, scribes, measures, calendars, and the story resumed with fresh names on old foundations. If you look at our world, contracts, courts, city councils, zoning, pay scales, archives, you are seeing Mesopotamia's shadow. The vocabulary has changed, the media are digital, but the logic of civilization, record, allocate, coordinate, legitimize, was laid down in mud brick and clay. When we study Mesopotamia, we aren't chasing a lost wonder. We're tracing the blueprint of ordinary power, the daily work of keeping people fed, accounts accurate, and gods or principles appeased. Empires later scaled these practices across continents, but the template was already here. In the quiet of those early mornings, when irrigation gates opened and boats pushed off along reed-lined canals, a new rhythm of human life began, measured, written, and shared. From that rhythm came laws, stories, and cities whose echoes still structure our days. In the next chapter, we'll watch how Egypt shaped divine kingship and permanence. But remember, the habit of writing things down, of making rules and measuring time, was born here, between two rivers, where clay held humanity's first durable memory.
Egypt begins with the river. Each year, the Nile rose from summer into early autumn, laying down a ribbon of fertile black silt along its banks. When the waters receded, fields were planted in a predictable rhythm. That reliable cycle, flood, sowing, harvest, made planning possible, taxation measurable, and authority credible. Where water keeps time, the government can keep books. By around 3100 BCE, the lands of Upper and Lower Egypt were unified under a single ruler, often associated with Narmer, remembered on a ceremonial palette that celebrates victory and kingship. From this moment, the pharaoh stood as the axis of order, embodying Ma'at, the principle of balance, justice, and right relationship between gods, land, and people. Egypt's administration was as monumental as its architecture. The kingdom was divided into nomes, districts, each overseen by a nomarch. At the top stood the vizier, the king's chief official, coordinating courts, storage, and state projects. Scribes, trained to master hieroglyphic and, for daily business, the more cursive hieratic script, turned grain, labor, and land into records. Power here meant paperwork as much as pyramids. The Old Kingdom, around 2686 to 2181 BCE, transformed stone into ideology. At Saqqara, King Djoser's step pyramid, designed by the official Imhotep around the 27th century BCE, tried something audacious, a complex of courtyards, chapels, and the earliest large-scale stone architecture. Later, at Giza, Khufu's Great Pyramid, around 2580 to 2560 BCE, along with those of Khafre and Menkaure, rose from the plateau to make a permanent argument, the king's divine right and his capacity to mobilize a nation. These pyramids were not miracles of lost technology. Archaeology shows quarry marks, worker graffiti, ramps, and logistic systems. Evidence from the workers' cemeteries and settlement remains suggests teams of rotating laborers fed with bread, beer, and meat, supplemented by specialists, artisans, and administrators. It was state-organized labor, not alien knowledge, and not a mass of enslaved people building under the lash. Even stone needs stories. The pharaoh was Horus in life and Osiris in death, a bridge between heaven and earth. Temples managed estates, stored grain, and performed daily rites to feed the gods' images. When the annual flood was good, the king had proven harmony with the cosmos. When disaster struck, legitimacy strained, and elites in the provinces grew bolder. The Old Kingdom eventually faltered, likely from a mix of decentralization, economic pressure, and environmental stress, ushering in a period of fragmentation modern scholars call the First Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom, around 2055 to 1650 BCE, rebuilt coherence from crisis. Kings such as Mentuhotep II, and later the dynasty beginning with Amenemhat I, rebalanced court and provinces, expanded irrigation, and fortified boundaries. Literature flourished. The instructions advising princes, tales like the story of Sinuhe, and laments that looked clear-eyed at disorder. Stability returned, not as a miracle, but as policy. Egypt was not sealed from the world. To the south, Nubia, rich in gold and connected to Inner Africa, was both partner and prize. To the northeast lay routes into the Levant. In the Second Intermediate Period, Western Asiatic groups, including the Hyksos, established rule in the Delta, c. 1650 to 1550 BCE, bringing Near Eastern technologies like the horse-drawn chariot and improved composite bows. Egypt learned from rivals and then responded decisively. The New Kingdom, c. 1550 to 1069 BCE, was Egypt at imperial stride. Ahmose I drove the Hyksos out and launched an age of expansion. Thutmose III campaigned into the Levant. The administration scaled to manage tribute and trade. Temples at Karnak and Luxor expanded, their pylons, hypostyle halls, and obelisks turning theology into an urban skyline. The god Amun merged with solar power as Amun-Ra, anchored Thebes as a religious capital. One of the most remarkable rulers was Hatshepsut, c. 1479 to 1458 BCE, a woman who took kingly titles and portrayed herself in royal regalia. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri terraces into the cliffs, and reliefs show an expedition to Punt, probably along the Red Sea coast toward the Horn of Africa, bringing incense trees, gold, and exotic goods. Her reign emphasized building, trade, and internal prosperity. Egypt also experimented with theological centralization under Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, c. 1353 to 1336 BCE, who elevated the Aten, the sun disk, and built a new capital at Akhetaton, modern Amarna. Artistic styles shifted, elongated heads, intimate family scenes, and radiant Aten rays ending in tiny hands. After his death, the court restored traditional cults. Tutankhamun, famous for his mostly intact tomb discovered in 1922, re-embraced Amun. The episode shows how even in Egypt, ideology could be contested within the palace walls. Ramesses II, c. 1279 to 1213 BCE, ruled long and built broadly. Temples at Abu Simbel moved in modern times to save them from the rising waters of the Aswan High Dam. Reliefs celebrating the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, c. 1274 BCE. The result was not a clear battlefield victory, but a negotiated peace, the world's earliest known surviving peace treaty, acknowledging power, limits, and mutual interest. As the Late Bronze Age unraveled across the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century BCE, Egypt faced internal stress and seaborne incursions remembered as Sea Peoples. By Ramesses III's time, early 12th century BCE, the state still projected strength but fought attrition. In his reign, we see the earliest recorded labor strike. The artisans of Deir el-Medina withheld work when rations failed, proof that even in a mighty system, logistics were the lifeblood. After the New Kingdom, authority fragmented in the Third Intermediate Period, c. 1069 to 664 BCE, with Libyan dynasties, priestly power in Thebes, and Nubian kings from Kush at times ruling Egypt. The Late Period, c. 664 to 332 BCE, brought resurgence under the Saite kings, renewed building, and an archaizing pride that looked back to Old Kingdom forms. But the geopolitical map had shifted. New empires rose to the east. In 525 BCE, Cambyses II of the Achaemenid Persian Empire conquered Egypt, inaugurating a period of foreign rule. Egypt regained autonomy briefly, then fell again to Persian control. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt and was hailed as a liberator. The Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek in origin but Egyptian in self-presentation, ruled from Alexandria, a new city of libraries, lighthouses, and cosmopolitan trade. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies, navigated the storm of Roman civil wars. After the defeat of her ally Mark Antony at Actium in 31 BCE and her death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province. Pharaoh survived as an idea, but the power now wore a Roman title. Through all these political shifts, core institutions endured. Temples were economic engines, owning land and labor, issuing rations and commissioning buildings. The calendar, a 365-day civil system, underpinned administration and ritual. Nilometers measured flood levels to set tax expectations. The ideology of Ma'at demanded that rulers maintained balance. Injustice was not merely a legal problem, but a cosmic threat. Egypt's material culture turned ideology into daily practice. In houses and tombs, people brewed beer, baked bread, and recorded contracts on papyrus. Medicine, preserved in texts like the Edwin Smith and Ebers papyri, mixed practical observation with incantation. Craftspeople mastered copper, later bronze and some iron. They quarried limestone, granite, and sandstone, transported by river barges and moved with sledges, rollers, and levers. When you stand before a colossal statue, you are seeing logistics, teams, schedules, rations, and a chain of command. The afterlife was not an abstract hope, it was a managed project. Mummification aimed to preserve the body so the person could live again. Coffin texts and later selections known as the Book of the Dead offered spells and guidance through the trials beyond. Tombs shifted from pyramids to rock-cut chambers in the Valley of the Kings, a practical response to security and a theological shift in royal burial. The decoration, fields of reeds, solar boats, and gods, mapped a universe where order could be re-won every night. Not everything in popular imagination meets the evidence. The Curse of the Pharaohs is a modern legend, not an ancient warning backed by data. Pyramids were not power plants. Alignments are explainable by religious and practical orientations, and the artistry and engineering were human, cumulative, and publicly recorded in quarries, ramps, and workers' marks. The spectacle was real. The supernatural shortcuts are not required. Language holds the keys to this world. Hieroglyphs, formal pictorial signs, coexisted with hieratic and later demotic scripts for faster writing. The Rosetta Stone, carved in 196 BCE under Ptolemy V with the same decree in hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek, allowed modern scholars, most famously Jean-François Champollion in 1822, to decipher the ancient scripts. Decipherment opened not just royal boasts, but letters, receipts, and school exercises, the texture of a society. Women in Egypt could own property, initiate divorce, and act as witnesses in legal documents. Queens could be powerful, and in rare cases, like Hatshepsut, rule as king. These rights did not create modern equality, but they reveal a legal flexibility uncommon in many ancient societies. Social life ranged across farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, priests, administrators, and entertainers. The tomb of an official might show banquets, not because life was always easy, but because commemoration desired abundance. The economy ran on grain, labor in kind, and redistributive storage. Taxation filled state granaries, workers were paid in rations, temples consumed and redistributed. Silver functioned as a unit of account in some periods, but coinage as daily currency became common only in the late period and Ptolemaic times. Trade moved papyrus, linen, stones, incense, and metals. Ships stitched the Nile's two-way highway to the Mediterranean and Red Sea routes. Egypt's art insists on continuity, clear profiles, composite views, canon of proportions, and registers that tell stories in lanes. This was not inability to draw realistically, but a visual grammar serving legibility and order. Even when Amarna art briefly bent the rules, the system snapped back. Like the river's flood, art reasserted the rhythm of Ma'at.
Why did Egypt last so long? Geography sheltered it. Desert on either side, cataracts to the south, Mediterranean to the north. The river's calendar disciplined planning. Ideology demanded that rulers care for justice, irrigation, and temple service. Administration trained generations of scribes who moved between reigns and crises with their tablets and formulas. When a system solves food, flood, and fate, it can endure change at the top. Why did it change? Over centuries, the same strengths could become constraints. Temple wealth grew powerful. Provincial elites could rival the court. Foreign rivals learned Egypt's playbook, and global shocks, migrations, new weapons, disrupted trade, forced adaptation. Egypt did adapt, repeatedly, but like all empires, it was not a single story. It was many overlapping solutions to the same ancient problems. If Mesopotamia taught humanity to write down obligations, Egypt taught rulers to write in stone, declaring that order, once achieved, should be visible, repeatable, and beautiful. Every pylon and obelisk speaks the same sentence. Power is the ability to make your version of the world outlast your lifetime. And yet, stone weathers. Names on cartouches were hammered out, then restored. Kings usurped monuments and reinscribed them. Sands covered courts and statues. The miracle is not that time eroded Egypt, but that its institutions lasted for 3 millennia, reinterpreted by Persians, Greeks, Romans, and much later by us, reading their words again. As we leave the Nile's glittering path, remember the lesson Egypt offers to every later empire. Legitimacy is infrastructure. If you can feed the people, predict the river, pay the workers, and convince the gods or your citizens that you serve Ma'at, your state can speak with the voice of granite. When that voice grows hollow, collapse is not an instant, it is a long echo fading in the wind. Next, we will cross the sea to Greece, where ideas, citizenship, debate, philosophy will build influence without a single river to tell them when to sow. But the Greek story, like so many others, will still glance back at Egypt's stone grammar and the calm authority of a river that kept time.
Greece begins not with a single river, but with islands and peninsulas scattered across a bright sea. In this fractured landscape, communities called polis, city-states, took root. From roughly the 8th to 4th centuries BCE, these cities argued, traded, fought, and thought their way into an influence far larger than their farmland. After the collapse of palace societies in the late Bronze Age, an archaic era, circa 100 to 480 BCE, saw recovery. Population grew, Writing returned using an alphabet adopted from Phoenician, and coinage began to circulate. Poetry moved memory into meter. Homeric epics were performed, not authored in our modern sense, but they offered shared stories that communities could quote, debate, and challenge. Colonization was as much as settlement. From the 8th to 6th centuries BCE, Greeks founded colonies from Massalia, modern Marseille, to Syracuse and along the Black Sea coast. Colonies relieved land pressure, opened trade routes, and spread a common language and toolkit: temples, markets, assemblies, weights, and measures. The Aegean became a network. Politics experimented in public. In Athens, reforms traditionally associated with Solon around 594 BCE eased debt burdens and reorganized civic participation. Around 508-507 BCE, measures linked with Cleisthenes restructured tribes and councils, making space for a wider citizen body to speak and vote. Democracy here meant direct participation by male citizens in assembly and jury courts. Women, enslaved persons, and resident foreigners, medics, were excluded. Real empowerment for some, structured silence for others. The hoplite phalanx, citizen infantry in bronze helmets and large shields, changed warfare and politics. Success depended on training, cohesion, and standing shoulder to shoulder. When farmers fight as equals in a line, it is easier to argue they deserve a voice in the city. Military form pressed against political form. Religion framed civic identity without a central scripture. Each polis honored its gods with festivals, sacrifices, and games. Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Delphi and Olympia drew rival cities into shared rituals and rivalries. Oracles advised leaders, and victors earned prestige. Greek religion was public, ritual, and local, less about doctrine than about doing the right things at the right times. The Persian Wars tested and clarified that identity. In 490 BCE, Athenians and allies defeated a Persian force at Marathon. 10 years later, Xerxes' invasion burned temples on the Acropolis, yet a coalition led by Athens and Sparta held the pass at Thermopylae briefly, withdrew, and then shifted strategy to the sea. At Salamis in 480 BCE, Athenian-led triremes used tight waters and disciplined rowing to break a larger fleet. At Plataea in 479 BCE, Greek hoplites ended the campaign. The victories did not make Greece one state, but they confirmed a habit: think together under pressure, then argue again in freedom.
Athens turned wartime leadership into the Delian League, an alliance to deter Persia that gradually became an Athenian empire. Tribute, often paid in silver, funded fleets, pay for jurors, monumental building, and cultural patronage. Pericles, the most prominent statesman of mid-5th century BCE Athens, championed this civic confidence. Between 447 and 332 BCE, the Parthenon rose on the Acropolis, a Doric temple with refined proportions and sculptural programs linking myth, identity, and civic pride. Dramatic festivals made politics audible. In tragedy, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides used myth to probe justice, leadership, and suffering. In comedy, Aristophanes mocked policies and personalities by name. Theater was not escapism, it was civic argument in poetic form, staged before thousands. When a city funds plays, it funds self-critique. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, pitted Sparta and its allies against Athens and its maritime system. Thucydides, an Athenian general turned historian, analyzed the conflict in terms of fear, interest, and power. His work avoided divine causation, seeking what could be observed and reasoned, an early template for disciplined history. The war ended with Athens' defeat, brief oligarchic rule, and eventual recovery. The deeper consequence was exhaustion across the Greek world. Philosophy moved argument from the assembly to the nature of knowledge and ethics. Socrates questioned assumptions in public spaces, pressing citizens to define their terms and live examined lives. His trial and execution in 399 BCE exposed tensions between free inquiry and civic authority. Plato, his student, founded the academy and explored justice, forms, and the philosopher's role. Aristotle, Plato's student, opened the Lyceum, classifying constitutions, analyzing drama, and building logic into a craft. These were not ivory tower pursuits. They trained generations to reason about evidence, causes, and ends. Science and medicine sought natural explanations. Physicians associated with Hippocrates in the late 5th century BCE composed treatises that emphasized observation and prognosis. They were not modern medicine, but they moved attention from omens to symptoms. In mathematics, Pythagorean communities investigated number and proportion. Later, Euclid in Hellenistic Alexandria around 300 BCE systematized geometry into axioms and proofs. Archimedes of Syracuse around 287 to 212 BCE would probe levers, buoyancy, and approximations of pi, curiosity with calculation. The economy underwrote culture. Athens' silver mines at Laurion financed fleets and festivals. Coinage facilitated exchange across the Aegean. Amphora stamps traced trade in wine and oil. Households were productive units. Slavery was integrated into domestic work, workshops, and agriculture. These facts matter. Democracy and drama rested on labor, some of it free, some of it unfree. Art and architecture balanced order with experiment. Doric, Ionic, and later Corinthian styles offered a grammar for temples and stoas. Sculptors moved from rigid, archaic Kouroi to the dynamism and realism of the classical period. Public spaces like the agora mixed commerce, courts, and conversation, a physical syllabus for citizenship. Sparta offers a foil, a dual kingship, a small citizen body trained from youth for military discipline, and a large population of helots, unfree laborers, sustained its system. Sparta could be formidable in battle and conservative in policy. Its reputation later inspired admirers and critics alike. Greek variety is the lesson. There was no single Greek model, only competing solutions to shared problems.
In the 4th century BCE, Macedon rose under Philip II. He reorganized the army, adding the long Sarissa pike to a flexible phalanx, integrated cavalry, and exploited diplomacy and siege technology. After victory over a Greek coalition at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, he created a league nominally uniting the Greek cities. His son, Alexander, inherited resources and aims, and in 334 BCE crossed into Asia. Alexander's campaigns, 334 to 323 BCE, broke the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Battles at the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela opened the route to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. He founded cities named Alexandria along lines of communication and settlement. His rule combined conquest with a rhetoric of fusion. Persian officials joined administration, soldiers married locally in some cases, and Greek culture traveled with garrisons, merchants, and teachers. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his commanders, the Diadochi, divided the empire, but the cultural aftershock endured. The Hellenistic world, 323 to 31 BCE, translated Greek ideas into new scales and languages. Kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in much of Asia, Antigonids in Macedon, ruled with bureaucracies and standing armies. Alexandria's museon and library supported scholarship. Koine Greek became a common language of trade and learning from Egypt to Bactria. Philosophies adapted to cosmopolitan life.
Zeno taught Stoicism around 300 BCE, urging virtue in line with nature and reason. Epicurus founded his garden in 306 BCE, counseling measured pleasure and friendship. Skeptics refined doubt into method. Historians and geographers mapped a bigger world. Polybius in the 2nd century BCE analyzed Rome's rise with institutional clarity. Eratosthenes measured Earth's circumference with striking accuracy, using shadows and distances between cities. Hipparchus charted the heavens and advanced trigonometry. The Greek habit of asking why and demanding arguments found new patrons and new instruments. Greek art evolved with patrons and markets. Hellenistic sculpture embraced drama and emotion. Think of spiraling bodies and furrowed brows, while urban planning laid out grids, theaters, and stoas for larger, more diverse populations. Temples still rose, but ruler cults and cosmopolitan festivals joined city calendars. The polis survived, yet it shared space with royal courts and empires. What precisely is Greece's legacy? Not a single invention or law, but a set of methods, debate in assemblies and courts, historical inquiry guided by evidence, philosophy that separates argument from authority, mathematics built from definitions and proof, medicine attentive to pattern and prognosis. When later civilizations, Rome first and then cultures across 3 continents, sought a toolkit for public life and knowledge, they reached for these Greek instruments. We should avoid tidy myths. Greek democracy was local, limited, and often interrupted by war or faction. Greek science mixed insight with error. Philosophers disagreed on fundamentals. Yet, precisely because Greece was a conversation rather than a creed, its influence travels well. You can adopt the method without copying the city. By 146 BCE, Rome defeated the Achaean League and made Greece part of a growing empire. By 31 BCE, with the Battle of Actium, Hellenistic political independence effectively ended. And still, Greek teachers, texts, and styles educated Roman elites, shaped law and rhetoric, and gave names to constellations of thought. Conquest did not erase the conversation, it enlarged the audience. If Mesopotamia taught the world to record obligations and Egypt carved legitimacy into stone, Greece taught people to ask better questions in public. Its terrain scattered communities, its seas connected them, its institutions trained citizens to argue without ending the city. That skill of turning conflict into debate, curiosity into method, became the quiet empire that outlived walls and warships. Next, we will cross west to Rome, the state that scaled Greek ideas into roads, laws, and legions, and built a political architecture that still frames debates about citizenship and power. Rome begins with a story of hills and neighbors, not destiny. Along the Tiber, communities on the 7 hills formed alliances and rivalries. By tradition, the city's monarchy ended in 509 BCE, when elites replaced kings with an experiment in shared authority. Whether or not every legend is exact, what followed is clear. A republic built institutions that could scale from a valley to a world. The Roman Republic balanced powers by multiplying offices. 2 annually elected consuls led armies and presided in the city. The Senate, an assembly of former magistrates, advised and stabilized policy. Popular assemblies passed laws and elected magistrates. Praetors administered justice. Quaestors managed state finances. Censors periodically took the census and guarded public morals. No single office was permanent. The design favored continuity through turnover. Social tension shaped the constitution. In the early republic, patrician families dominated, but plebeians, common citizens, pushed for rights through what historians call the conflict of the orders. tribunes of the plebs emerged with sacrosanct status and the power to veto actions that harmed plebeians. Around the mid-5th century BCE, the 12 tables set down basic legal norms on bronze, public, visible, and appealable, turning custom into written reference. Expansion in Italy was pragmatic more than inevitable. Rome defeated Latin rivals, Samnites in the central highlands, and Greek cities in the south. Conquest did not always mean direct rule. Rome granted varying statuses, full citizenship, Latin rights, or treaty obligations, knitting allies into a military network. Roads like the Via Appia, begun 312 BCE, stitched Italy together. The census counted men not for abstraction, but for mobilization. Rome's wars with Carthage pivoted the city from peninsular power to Mediterranean actor. In the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, Rome learned naval warfare and secured Sicily. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, brought Hannibal over the Alps and disaster at Cannae in 216 BCE. Yet Rome's resilience, alliances held, manpower replenished, and strategy adjusted, prevailed. Scipio defeated Carthage at Zama in 202 BCE, ending Hannibal's campaign. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, erased Carthage as a state, while the same year Roman arms subdued Corinth. Greece would now navigate Roman rule. Expansion changed Rome more than Rome expected. Wealth and slaves flowed into the city. Provincial administration became permanent, and inequalities widened. Reformers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus in the late 2nd century BCE pushed for land redistribution and grain policies, provoking elite backlash and political violence. The Republic had acquired an empire. It struggled to remain a small city constitution. The army evolved under pressure. The older manipular legion, 3 lines by age and wealth, gave way during the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE to cohort organization and broader recruitment associated with Gaius Marius. Soldiers served longer terms, expected land on discharge, and often felt loyalty to their commanders as much as to the Senate. When legions follow generals, the Republic's balance tilts.
Civil wars tested the framework to destruction. Sulla marched on Rome in 88 to 82 BCE, exposing that legions could decide politics. He then reformed institutions to strengthen the Senate, but planted precedents for force. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey, built prestige with eastern campaigns. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, 58 to 50 BCE, crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, and defeated senatorial armies. Caesar centralized authority and planned reforms, but was assassinated in 44 BCE by senators who claimed to defend liberty. The final struggle set Mark Antony and Cleopatra against Octavian. After Actium in 31 BCE and Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Octavian stood alone. In 27 BCE, Octavian accepted the title Augustus, claiming to restore the Republic while holding the real levers, control of armies, provinces, and finance. The Principate was a constitutional fiction with administrative efficiency, Rome's monarchy without the name. Augustus reorganized taxation, created a civil service, instituted a fire brigade and police in the city, and settled veterans on land. Stability, the Pax Romana, was policy, not accident. Roman administration scaled by standardization. Provinces fell into senatorial and imperial categories. Governors collected taxes, commanded local troops, and administered justice. Cities remained the engines. Rome worked through municipalities, granting status and incentives for local elites to build baths, theaters, and aqueducts. The empire preferred partnership to micromanagement. The law traveled as a common language of contracts, wills, and property.
Infrastructure turned authority into habit. Roman concrete, pozzolanic mixtures that set underwater, freed builders from pure cut stone limits. Arches and vaults spanned distances. Aqueducts, like the Aqua Claudia, carried water over long gradients. Milestone-marked roads enabled legions, merchants, and messages to move predictably. If you can move things reliably, you can govern at scale. Urban life advertised the system. The Colosseum, inaugurated in 80 CE under Titus, staged spectacles of animals, gladiators, and public ceremony, politics as performance. The Pantheon, rebuilt under Hadrian and dedicated around 126 CE, married a traditional portico to a vast concrete dome with an oculus, engineering as theology of cosmos and empire. Baths, forums, and amphitheaters reproduced a recognizable Roman city from Britain to Syria. Law bound the parts. Jurists systematized doctrines, distinguishing jus civile, citizens' law, from jus gentium, principles applicable across peoples, and developing equity through praetorian edicts. Teachers like Gaius in the 2nd century CE produced handbooks. Later, the Digest under Justinian in the 6th century in the Eastern Empire would preserve classical juristic thought. Contracts, guardianship, property, and procedure became predictable. Predictability made strangers into trading partners. The army sat at the frontier and in the budget. Legionaries, Roman citizens, served long terms. Auxilia, non-citizen troops, earned pay and often citizenship on discharge. Forts lined rivers and roads. Hadrian's Wall, begun in 122 CE, marked a managed boundary in Britain with mile castles and gates for controlled movement and customs. Frontiers were not absolute lines, they were zones of trade, recruitment, and diplomacy. Citizenship widened across centuries. Enfranchisements followed service and policy. The landmark Constituzione Antoniniana in 212 CE under Caracalla extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. The move simplified taxation and legal categories. Rome's identity became less tied to the city and more to a legal umbrella.
Prosperity never ran on prestige alone. The annona, the grain supply, moved staples from provinces like Egypt and North Africa to urban consumers. State contracts chartered ships and scheduled deliveries. Warehouses ringed ports like Ostia. Coinage facilitated pay and tax, beginning with silver denarii in the late Republic, but fiscal stress, wars, donatives, and shocks pushed emperors to debase silver content in the 3rd century CE, fueling price instability. Administration fought back with edicts and requisitions. Logistics remained the empire's pulse. Religion in Rome was plural and procedural. Traditional cults honored gods with sacrifices and vows. Emperors were memorialized with public cult after death. New religions traveled roads, mystery cults, Judaism in diaspora, and Christianity. Persecutions were localized and episodic before the 4th century. The turning point came when Constantine, after defeating a rival at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, issued toleration, commonly linked to the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. By the later 4th century, emperors favored Christianity as imperial religion. Temples, basilicas, and laws reflected the shift. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE, revealed design limits, rapid imperial turnovers, external pressures on multiple frontiers, local usurpers, and economic strain. Plague and depopulation compounded problems. Yet the system adapted. Diocletian reorganized the empire under the Tetrarchy, 2 senior and 2 junior emperors, reformed taxation, tied assessments to periodic censuses, and tried to stabilize prices. Constantine later re-centralized authority, founded Constantinople in 330 CE as a new capital in the East, and retained many administrative reforms that professionalized bureaucracy and army. The late empire was not simply decay, it was transformation. Armies relied more on federate troops, barbarian allies settled within borders under obligation to fight. Law codes like the Theodosian, 438 CE, and later the Justinianic, 6th century East, compiled and harmonized legislation. Cities shifted, elites invested in churches as well as baths, and Latin and Greek cultural spheres diverged more clearly along an east-west axis. The Western Roman Empire faced compounding shocks. Goths, pressured by movements on the Eurasian steppe, crossed the Danube in 376 CE. After mismanagement and conflict, they defeated a Roman field army at Adrianople in 378 CE. In 410 CE, Alaric's Goths sacked Rome, a symbolic blow more than a strategic one, but the message resonated. Vandals crossed into North Africa by 429 CE, threatening the grain supply. They sacked Rome in 455 CE. In 476 CE, the general Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. The Western court ended. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium to us, endured. Explanations for Rome's fall multiply, but sober patterns recur. Succession instability, fiscal stress tied to military obligations, frontier pressures interacting with internal politics, and the difficulty of maintaining cohesive loyalty across vast distances. Environmental and epidemiological shocks mattered, so did policy and logistics. No single cause explains a world. Many ordinary stresses finally exceeded institutional capacity.
And yet, Rome did not vanish. The Eastern Empire preserved Roman law, tax systems, and imperial identity for centuries. The Latin West absorbed Roman municipalities, roads, and Christian institutions into successor kingdoms. The idea of Rome, its legalism, its urbanity, its memory, became the vocabulary of power in Europe and beyond. What, finally, is Rome's blueprint? First, modular institutions that can scale, municipal governance under provincial oversight, standardized offices with defined competencies, written law adoptable through juristic reasoning. Second, infrastructure that multiplies reach, roads, ports, aqueducts, and communications. Third, a military system linked to citizenship and reward, professional enough to hold borders but integrated with social mobility. Fourth, cultural technologies, Latin as administrative language, calendar and census rhythms, and public ritual that turn strangers into participants. Rome's dangers are the mirror of its strengths. Patronage can corrode merit, armies can become kingmakers, expansion can outrun revenue, ideology can mask fragility. When institutions become tools of factions instead of frameworks for disagreement, the republic fails. When the center cannot guarantee pay and protection, the empire frays. Rome teaches not triumphalism, but maintenance. If Mesopotamia taught the world to account, and Egypt carved authority in stone, Rome taught how to build a state that survives its founders, how to write rules, pave distances, and turn local habits into imperial routine. Its forums are ruins now, but its legal phrases, municipal charters, and engineering assumptions are still hard at work wherever people try to govern more than a village. In our next chapter, we cross east again to Persia, an empire that mastered rule at scale, not only through force, but through roads, posts, and respect for local customs, offering a different and surprisingly modern vision of how to hold a diverse world together. Persia's strength began with a different idea of empire. Where others ruled by erasing difference,
the Achaemenid Persians learned to manage it, turning a mosaic of languages, laws, and gods into a working state. Tolerance here was not softness, it was a strategy for scale. Around the mid-6th century BCE, Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, united Persian tribes under the Achaemenid banner and overthrew their overlords, the Medes, in 550 BCE. He then defeated Croesus of Lydia in 546 BCE, securing the prosperous cities of western Anatolia, and entered Babylon in 539 BCE, ending Neo-Babylonian rule. These victories mattered not only for territory, they added skilled administrators, road networks, and storied capitals to a growing toolbox. The tone of his rule survives in a famous object, the Cyrus cylinder, a Babylonian inscription that describes the king restoring sanctuaries and returning displaced peoples to their homes. Modern scholars treat it as royal propaganda, but it speaks a recognizable policy, legitimacy through respect for local traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus appears as the ruler who allowed Judean exiles to return and rebuild the temple at Jerusalem. The pattern is consistent: conquer, confirm local elites, and harvest loyalty rather than sow resentment. After Cyrus died in 530 BCE during a campaign on the empire's northeastern frontier, his son Cambyses II extended Persian power to Egypt in 525 BCE, defeating Psamtik III. Egypt's temples and bureaucracy were largely retained. Persian kings presented themselves as pharaoh to Egyptian eyes, another example of governance through accommodation. The empire's great organizer was Darius I, ruled 522 to 486 BCE. After securing the throne, he divided the realm into satrapies, provinces, each governed by a satrap, but monitored by royal officials, often called the king's eyes and ears. This dual line of authority limited local autonomy without strangling it. Standardized tribute assessments, weights and measures, and a stable gold coin, the daric, knit distant markets to the center. Darius did not merely centralize, he systematized. The royal road, most famously the stretch from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Elam, linked relay stations where mounted couriers changed horses. Herodotus admired the speed. Neither snow nor heat nor night stopped them. Messages that once took months could move in days, allowing the king to coordinate armies, taxes, and audits across thousands of kilometers.
Languages were not obstacles, they were instruments. Imperial administration widely employed Imperial Aramaic as a practical lingua franca for contracts and correspondence, while royal inscriptions appeared in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian to speak to different audiences at once. Diversity was turned into paperwork that could be read across borders. The empire's moral grammar drew on Zoroastrian concepts, truth, asha, versus the lie, druj, though practice remained plural and flexible. Persian kings made sacrifices to many gods in many lands. Their official inscriptions invoked Ahura Mazda, yet they funded and respected local cults. Asha provided a language of righteous rule without requiring uniform worship from Babylonians, Egyptians, or Greeks. Monumental building embodied administrative confidence. At Persepolis and Susa, Darius and his successors erected palaces and the Apadana, an audience hall supported by forest-like columns. Reliefs show delegations from across the empire bearing gifts, Bactrians with camels, Lydians with metal vessels, Indians with textiles. The scene is not of slaves chained to a throne, but of ordered reciprocity, distant communities acknowledging a center that protects roads, coinage, and law. The Behistun inscription, carved high on a cliff in western Iran, narrated Darius's early victories and asserted his legitimacy in 3 scripts. Like Egypt's Rosetta Stone, Behistun helped modern scholars decipher ancient languages. In its own time, it broadcast a message to travelers and subjects.
The king defeats rebels, rewards loyalty, and rules by order, not whim. Persian tolerance ran with practical infrastructure. Qanats, gentle underground channels tapping aquifers in foothills, carried water to fields and towns with minimal evaporation. This engineering sustained agriculture and garrisons in arid zones, enabling settlement and tax collection where surface rivers could not. You cannot legislate an empire into being, you have to water it. Darius also pushed east into the Indus Valley and north into Central Asia and probed the fringes of Europe. His conflict with mainland Greek cities began around the Ionian Revolt, 499 to 493 BCE, when Greek police in Anatolia, with some support from Athens and Eretria, rebelled against Persian-appointed tyrants. Darius suppressed the revolt and in 490 BCE sent an expedition that Athenians defeated at Marathon, a sharp check but not a terminal wound. Xerxes I, r. 486 to 465 BCE, Darius's son, planned a larger invasion. In 480 BCE, after crossing the Hellespont on pontoon bridges, he advanced through northern Greece. Spartan-led defenders held the pass at Thermopylae briefly. Athens was evacuated and the Acropolis burned. But at Salamis later that year, a Greek fleet lured Persian ships into narrow straits and broke their formation. In 479 BCE, Persian forces lost at Plataea on land and Mycale at sea. Strategically, Persia withdrew from mainland Greece, though it maintained deep power in Anatolia and beyond. The Greco-Persian wars forged Greek memory. For Persia, they were western skirmishes at the edge of a vast realm. After Xerxes, the empire continued through rulers named Artaxerxes and Darius, managing court intrigues and frontier challenges typical of states this large. What held it together was not invincibility, but routines, audited treasuries, satraps rotated or investigated, garrisons supplied by reliable logistics, and royal roads policed for banditry. When policy slipped, rebellions flared. When oversight tightened, order returned. Persian gardens, peri-diaza, the root of our word paradise, curated the empire in miniature. Ordered channels, fruit trees, exotic animals, shade, and geometry. They were metaphors for rule, diverse elements arranged into harmony by careful design. The same aesthetic guided tribute lists, ceremonies, and even clothing. Robes that signaled office and region, visual grammar for a multilingual court.
In 334 BCE, Alexander of Macedon crossed into Asia, carrying a disciplined army and a strategy of decisive engagements. Victories at the Granicus, Issus, 333 BCE, and Gaugamela, 331 BCE, shattered Achaemenid field forces. Darius III fled and was later killed during the collapse. Alexander took Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, where a notorious fire, likely fueled by drink and politics, damaged the palatial terraces. Yet even Alexander adopted elements of Persian governance, satrapal structures, road networks, and court ceremony, because they worked. The end of Achaemenid rule in 330 BCE did not end Persia. Parthian or Arsacid and later Sasanian empires revived Iranian kingship, adapted Hellenistic and Roman pressures, and continued long-distance trade between the Mediterranean, Central Asia, and India. The deep operating principle, governed through recognized local elites, shared infrastructure, and a portable legal administrative kit, remained viable for centuries. What precisely did Persian tolerance mean? Not modern equality or freedom of speech. It meant letting people keep their gods, languages, and customary laws so long as they paid, cooperated, and did not rebel. It meant using Aramaic scribes in Egypt, Babylonian accountants in Mesopotamia, and Lydian minting practices in Anatolia.
It meant measuring wealth in darics and art in woven tribute, not insisting that Babylon pray in Old Persian. Myths can cloud this picture. Popular stories of Persian cruelty or Greek heroism, sharpened by later literature and film, miss how often Persians preferred deal-making to destruction and administration to annihilation. They could be ruthless against mutiny, but the normal face of the empire was a tax receipt, a sealed contract, and a courier changing horses at dusk. The Achaemenid achievement was to make diversity legible. Satrapies translated terrain into ledgers, roads converted distance into time, coinage turned tribute into portable value. Multilingual inscriptions tied legitimacy to law. Tolerance was not sentimental, it was the cheapest way to keep a big world cooperative. If Mesopotamia invented the spreadsheet and Egypt carved authority in stone, Persia taught empires to breathe, to expand without insisting that everyone inside become the same. Its lessons travel well. Govern by reliable rules, respect workable local systems, build roads before statues, and let allegiance be a contract more than a crusade. Empires fall, good habits outlast them.
In China, political power claimed legitimacy not by blood alone, but by performance. The mandate of heaven, Tianming, taught that heaven, an impersonal moral order, grants rule to a dynasty that governs justly and withdraws it when rulers turn corrupt, oppressive, or incompetent. Floods, famine, rebellion, and defeat were read as warnings. This idea did not create stability forever. It explained how to critique failure without rejecting the state itself. The story takes form in the transition from the Shang to the Zhao. The late Shang dynasty, centered near Anyang, left divination inscriptions on oracle bones and cast fine bronze ritual vessels, 13th to 11th centuries BCE. Around 1046 BCE, King Wu of Zhao defeated the last Shang king at Muye. The Zhao justified their conquest by announcing that Shang had lost heaven's favor through misrule. Therefore, Zhao bore the duty to restore order. Political theory entered Chinese history as a moral audit. Western Zhao rulers, c. 1046 to 771 BCE, organized lands through enfeoffment. Relatives and allies governed regional domains in a network of hereditary lords owing ritual and military service. The Duke of Zhao, regent for a young king, became a model statesman, standardizing rights and presenting the mandate as both gift and burden. Govern well and keep it, fail and lose it. Ritual, li, music, and law braided court life and provincial obligations into a culture of hierarchy controlled by norms. Pressure broke the arrangement. In 771 BCE, external attack and internal faction drove the royal house east to Luoyang, inaugurating the Eastern Zhao. Authority fragmented. Regional states gained confidence and fought for influence. The spring and autumn period, c. 770 to 453 BCE, still recognized a Zhao king, but power clustered in hegemonic states. By the Warring States era, 453 to 221 BCE, only a handful of strong kingdoms, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, contested primacy with reforms, iron weapons, cavalry, and large infantry. Ideas multiplied in crisis. Confucius, Kongzi, 551 to 479 BCE, taught that order begins with personal virtue, correct ritual, and benevolent rule. Rulers should be models, not merely enforcers. Mozi argued for universal concern and merit over pedigree. Taoist texts associated with Laozi and Zhuangzi urged alignment with the natural way, skeptical of forced schemes.
Legalists, most sharply Han Fei, d. 233 BCE, insisted that clear laws, strict rewards and punishments, and centralized control, not moral example, create reliable states. Competing schools offered rulers a menu. The age's laboratory was political. Qin chose a hard path and won. Under King Zhang, later Qin Shi Huang, Qin exploited earlier reforms by Xiangyang, population registration, standardized districts, agricultural incentives, and harsh penalties. Through campaigns culminating in 221 BCE, Qin defeated rival states and proclaimed the first centralized empire. The king renamed himself First Emperor, signaling that rule was no longer a cycle of lords, but a single, universal command.
Standardization made scale possible. Qin unified weights and measures, set axle widths for carts to fit state-built roads, and issued a common script style to ease administration across former kingdoms. The empire organized terrain into commanderies and counties, governed by appointed officials. Aristocratic privileges shrank. Massive projects, linking and extending earlier frontier walls against northern nomads, building palatial complexes like Shenyang, and mobilizing labor for canals and roads, spoke in the voice of speed and control. But force alone could not sustain legitimacy. Qin's penal code was severe. Book burnings and executions targeted ideas seen as subversive to uniform policy. After Qin Shi Huang's death in 210 BCE, court struggles and rebellion toppled the regime within years. The mandate language returned. Harshness had maintained order briefly, but it could not recruit consent. The empire stayed, the dynasty did not. The Han, 202 BCE to 220 CE, restored longevity by mixing legalist institutions with Confucian ideals. Liu Bang, the founder, Emperor Gaozu, reined in extreme punishments and rewarded allies while keeping the county commandery system. Under Emperor Wu, ruled 141 to 87 BCE, the state expanded against the Xiongnu Confederacy, sent Chan Chen west from 138 BCE to open diplomatic corridors towards Central Asia, and asserted ritual supremacy at home. Confucian scholar Dong Zhongshu argued that heaven's patterns and human governance were linked. Omens criticized policy, and emperors were urged to correct themselves. Han administration refined tools of rule. Censuses counted households for tax and labor. Salt and iron revenues stirred the famous discourses on salt and iron debate, 81 BCE, between advocates of state monopolies and defenders of private enterprise. Paper, traditionally connected to Kai Lun in 105 CE, though early forms existed, spread record-keeping. Agriculture, crafts, and long-distance trade along routes later called the Silk Roads moved silk, metalwork, horses, and ideas. Buddhism entered from India during the late Han and grew in the centuries that followed. Dynasties, like rivers, silt up. The later Han suffered court faction, eunuch influence, land consolidation, and peasant distress, exposed by the Yellow Turban Rebellion beginning in 184 CE. In 220 CE, the Han Mandate ended. Regional warlords controlled competing realms remembered as the Three Kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu. The Jin reunified briefly, 280 CE, but nomadic and mixed polities rose in the north. The south remained under Han Chinese dynasties. Buddhism flourished in translation centers. Art and philosophy adapted to war and migration. The Sui, 581 to 618 CE, reunified by administration and infrastructure. Emperor Wen strengthened law and taxation. Emperor Yang drove the Grand Canal's construction, linking the Yangtze grainlands to northern capitals. The canal turned geography into a policy instrument. Food and troops could move on water, cheaply and predictably.
Costly wars, however, exhausted the state and triggered rebellion. The Tang, 618 to 907 CE, blended conquest with cosmopolitan culture. Chang'an, the capital, swelled with merchants and envoys. The equal field system allocated land for tax equity, and the examination system, rooted in earlier practices, expanded to select officials by literary skill and mastery of Confucian classics. Poetry by Li Bai and Du Fu, woodblock printing by the 8th and 9th centuries, and Buddhist art along the Silk Roads made a confident civilization. The An Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 CE, shattered population and finances. Regional military governors gained power, and although the dynasty endured for another century, decentralization deepened. The Song, 960 to 1279 CE, reinvented prosperity without a cavalry empire. Administrators professionalized the civil service. Neo-Confucian thinkers like Zhu Qi systematized learning and ethics, and the economy surged. Champa rice, an early ripening variety, boosted multi-cropping. Iron production and urban markets expanded. Paper money appeared in the 11th century. The compass guided ships, and gunpowder moved from alchemy to warfare. The Jurchen Jin seized the north in 1127 CE. The southern Song held the south, competitive in trade and technology, but militarily constrained. The Mongols under Kublai Khan conquered the southern Song by 1279 and proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, established 1271. They kept much of the administrative machine, employed multi-ethnic officials, protected long-distance trade, and linked Eurasia in a way no prior empire had. Yet plague, floods, and fiscal strain eroded confidence. Native rebellions, many invoking heaven's displeasure, rose in the mid-14th century. The Ming, 1368 to 1644, began with Zhu Yuanzhang, Hongwu, who rebuilt agriculture, revived the county government, and, suspicious of court factions, tightened control over officials. Early in the 15th century, Admiral Zheng He's treasure fleets, 1405 to 1433, projected maritime prestige across the Indian Ocean. Later rulers reduced such ventures, focused on internal defense, and in the 15th-16th centuries strengthened and rebuilt large sections of the northern fortifications, the Ming Great Wall, against steppe threats. A note for myth-busting: the Great Wall is impressive, but it is not visible from space with the naked eye. Ming governance mixed achievement with rigidity. The single whip tax reform in the 1580s monetized obligations. Silver flows tied the economy to global trade. Court factions and rural distress grew. Natural disasters and frontier pressures mounted. Religious sects and secret societies framed rebellion in moral language. The mandate's barometer, grain prices, floods, banditry, fell toward the storm. The Qing, 1644 to 1911, conquered China proper and expanded the empire to Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan. High Qing emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, Qianlong, promoted a multilingual, multi-ethnic imperial project. Population surged with New World crops like maize and sweet potatoes. Scholars compiled massive textual projects. Jesuit missionaries presented astronomy and cartography at court. Matteo Ricci had earlier arrived in 1601, and scientific exchange continued under careful constraints. The 19th century stressed the system beyond reform's pace. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, and subsequent treaties opened ports and ceded privileges to foreign powers. The Taiping War, 1850 to 1864, one of history's deadliest civil wars, devastated central and southern China. Muslim and other regional uprisings further drained the state. Self-strengthening policies imported arsenals and schools, but left fiscal and political structures uneven. Modernizers and conservatives debated how to use Chinese learning for essence and Western learning for utility, an echo of older syntheses, Confucian ends, legalist means. The exam system, once a meritocratic ladder, ossified into rote learning. Abolished in 1905, it left a vacuum in elite recruitment. In 1911, provincial armies and reformist elites revolted. The last emperor abdicated in early 1912. Dynastic time ended, but the narrative frame, rule legitimized by performance and revoked by failure, remained a habit of political thought. What made the mandate durable was its balance of morality and pragmatism. It demanded that rulers tax lightly in bad years, repair dikes, punish corruption, and listen to remonstrance. It allowed officials to press the throne to correct errors. It gave rebels a vocabulary to claim justice without rejecting the state's ideal. Unlike divine right theories, the mandate did not promise rule forever, only so long as governance met a public standard. Administrative depth carried the idea across eras. Regardless of dynasty, the county magistrate, the parent official, judged cases, collected taxes, and organized corvée. Above him, prefects and provincial governors audited reports. At the center, the secretariat and ministries counted grain, men, and money. The examination system, especially from the Tang and Song onward, recruited officials by learning rather than lineage. Education taught not only texts, but habits: record, memorialize, correct. Bureaucracy became the empire's muscle memory.
China's story is not a monotone of order. Frontier peoples, Xiongnu, Khitan, Jurchen, Mongols, Manchus, were not simply enemies. They traded, intermarried, and at times ruled. Buddhism, arriving over centuries, helped people think about suffering and kingship. Taoism shaped ritual and medicine. Confucianism infused family law and public ethics. The state managed diversity through registers and rituals, the secular echo of Persia's administrative tolerance, but with a moral vocabulary centered on heaven's approval. Myths are unnecessary here. The Great Wall cannot be seen from space unaided. The terracotta army was crafted for a specific 3rd century BCE tomb, not by mysterious outsiders. Confucius did not rule a state. He taught, advised, and was later canonized as a moral authority. The real achievements are concrete: canals that moved grain, ledgers that moved taxes, and schools that moved talent into office. If Mesopotamia taught accounting, Egypt monumentalized kingship. Greece argued methods, Rome built institutions, and Persia organized diversity. China braided morality to administration. The mandate of heaven turned weather and prices into a report card for rulers, while a nationwide bureaucracy converted rivers, fields, and villages into governable units. When rulers listened, dynasties endured. When they silenced remonstrance and starved canals, heaven's silence became a verdict. As we leave the Yellow River's dust and the Yangtze's mist, carry this lesson forward. In China's political imagination, legitimacy is earned and audited. The empire might change banners, capitals, and borderlines, but the basic promise remains the same: care for the people, keep the waters in their banks, reward merit, punish corruption, and heaven will permit your house to stand. When you fail, it will not.
The Islamic Golden Age was not a single institution or a single city. It was a network. From the 8th through the 13th centuries, and in some fields beyond, cities across the Islamic world created a culture of scholarship, translation, experiment, and debate that connected Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac learning to Arabic, and then carried it onward to Latin and other languages. Baghdad set the tempo. Founded in 762 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur on the Tigris, it was planned as a round capital,
a symbol of order at the center of a widening world. Under Al-Mamun, rule 813 to 833, the translation movement accelerated. Scholars commissioned, corrected, and commented on works of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and many others. What we call the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, was less a single building than a patronage ecosystem. Libraries, copyists, debate circles, and observatories funded by rulers, officials, and charitable endowments. Paper changed the scale. Knowledge flourished where copying was cheap, and by the 9th century, papermaking techniques previously developed in China were adopted and improved across the Abbasid realm. Whether or not a specific battle brought paper is less important than this fact. Paper shops appeared in cities from Baghdad to Damascus and Cairo, turning scholarly labor into libraries. Translation was the first step. Critique and expansion followed. Al-Kindi, circa 801 to 870, wrote on philosophy, optics, and music theory, arguing for harmonies between reason and revelation. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, circa 809 to 873, and his circle translated and systematized medical Greek into Arabic with a philologist's precision, comparing manuscripts, improving terminology, and producing glossaries so doctors could read accurately. In mathematics, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, circa 780 to 850, wrote a treatise that gave algebra its name, Al-Jabr, and offered systematic methods for solving linear and quadratic equations by completion and balancing. He also helped standardize the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, positional notation with a symbol for zero, whose roots were Indian. The Islamic world adopted, adapted, and popularized it, and Latin Europe later learned it through Arabic texts. Algorithm, our word, preserves al-Khwarizmi's name. Trigonometry became an independent discipline. Al-Battani, 858 to 929, refined values for the solar year, distinguished astronomical from civil years, and used sines and tangents in methods that would inform later astronomers. In the 11th through 13th centuries, scholars such as Al-Biruni, 973 to 1048, and Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi, 1201 to 1274, pushed spherical trigonometry and geometric devices that later fed into discussions of planetary motion. Optics pivoted from philosophy to experiment with Hassan ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazan, circa 965 to 1040. His Book of Optics argued against long-standing Greek ideas that vision occurs when light enters the eye, not when rays leave it. He combined controlled experiments with geometry, used the camera obscura to analyze image formation, and proposed methods to test hypotheses. Centuries later, Latin translators cited his work as a model of experimental reasoning.
Medicine moved from compendia to clinic. Abu Bakr al-Razi, Razi's 865 to 925, directed hospitals, distinguished smallpox from measles in careful clinical prose, and urged physicians to trust observation when authorities disagreed. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, 980 to 1037, synthesized Greco-Islamic medical knowledge in the canon of medicine, organizing diseases, pharmacology, and diagnostics into a reference used in both Islamic lands and Europe for centuries. Hospitals, bimaristans, in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, offered wards by disease, on-site pharmacies, teaching rounds, and endowment-funded care. Geography and earth sciences were empirical. Al-Biruni measured the Earth's radius using trigonometric observations from mountaintops, compared monsoon cycles, and described India's religions and sciences with notable respect and precision. Cartographers compiled books of routes and realms, while nautical texts recorded winds, ports, and currents across the Indian Ocean,
where Arab and Persian mariners sailed seasonal monsoons in lateen-rigged dhows. Philosophy and theology argued in public. Al-Farabi, died 950, wrote on logic and the ideal city. Later, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, 1126 to 1198, commented on Aristotle with rigor that shaped Latin scholasticism. Theologians like Al-Ghazali, 1056 to 1111, critiqued some philosophers' claims while preserving logic as a tool for jurisprudence and theology. The result was not a monolithic doctrine, but an argumentative culture with rules, a civic virtue for scholars. Astronomy built institutions. Observatories in Baghdad, Damascus, and later at Maraga, founded 1259 under the Ilkhanid patronage of Hulegu and directed by Tusi, housed large instruments, mural quadrants, armillary spheres, and teams compiling new astronomical tables, ziges. Their models critiqued Ptolemaic devices and mathematical instruments like the Tusi couple, which converts circular motions into linear oscillations, appear in later European works. Engineering and practical arts solved daily problems. Treatises detailed water-raising machines, automata powered by water and air, the Banu Musa brothers, 9th century, and sophisticated clocks. Urbanists designed markets with regulated stalls, inspectors enforced weights and measures, and jurists wrote on hisba, the oversight of public welfare, pricing fairness, and cleanliness. Agriculture diversified. Across the Middle East, North Africa, and Al-Andalus, farmers grew sugarcane, citrus, bananas, cotton, and rice in more places, using techniques like kanats, subterranean channels, norias, water wheels, and new crop rotations. Historians debate the scale and speed of this agricultural revolution, but the documentary record, diets, tax registers, agronomic manuals, shows meaningful change in crops and irrigation that supported denser urban life. Poetry, art, and music set the rhythm. Courts sponsored musicians who theorized about modes, maqamat. Calligraphers turned Quranic scripts into architectural ornaments, and artisans in Damascus, Nishapur, and Kashan developed luster pottery and inlaid metalwork. In Cordoba and later Seville and Granada, Umayyad and Taifa courts blended Arabic, Romance, and Hebrew cultures. Philosophers and physicians such as Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, who wrote largely in Arabic, walked the same streets. Cairo rose with the Fatimids in 969 and later the Ayyubids and Mamluks. Its Al-Azhar Mosque University, established 970, became a durable center of legal and theological learning. In the Maghrib, Fez and Tlemcen nurtured scholars. In Iran and Central Asia, Nishapur, Rai, Bukhara, and Samarkand stitched scholarship to trade on the Silk Roads. The Golden Age is a web, not a point.
Knowledge also traveled west. From the 12th century, translation centers in places like Toledo and Sicily rendered Arabic works into Latin. Gerard of Cremona translated Ptolemy's Almagest through Arabic. Translators carried Avicenna's canon and Alhazen's optics into European universities. These were not one-way borrowings. Debates in Paris and Padua reworked the materials, but the bridge was Arabic. Power shaped scholarship, and politics could wound it. In 1258, the Mongol sack of Baghdad ended the Abbasid capital's primacy. Libraries burned, scholars fled or died, and the caliphate as a political institution collapsed. Yet learning persisted and relocated. Cairo under the Mamluks, Tabriz and Maraga under the Ilkhanids, later Samarkand and Herat under Timurids, and still later Istanbul under the Ottomans. The intellectual habits, commentary, critique, endowments, and schools proved mobile. Let's clear a few myths.
First, the phrase Dark Ages for medieval Europe is misleading. While the Islamic world led in many sciences during these centuries, Byzantium and Latin Europe also preserved and developed learning. Second, the House of Wisdom was not a lone wonder library toppled in a day. It named a larger scholarly milieu. Third, zero and positional numerals were Indian innovations. The Islamic world transmitted and refined them with transformative effect. Why did this flowering happen? Three conditions stand out. A common scholarly language, Arabic, made far-flung correspondence legible. Patronage by caliphs, sultans, judges, merchants, and waqf endowments paid stipends, built hospitals and madrasas, and stocked libraries. And a pragmatic curiosity, how to calculate inheritance shares, determine prayer times, fix calendars, navigate deserts and seas, and treat patients, drove disciplined method. Why did it change? Politics fragmented. Invasions and plagues disrupted cities. Some courts shifted patronage toward other priorities, and over time, institutional routines hardened into commentary more than discovery in certain fields. But the narrative is not decline into silence, it is diffusion. Techniques in algebra, optics, medicine, and navigation entered wider circuits, from Venice to Oxford to Samarkand, and continued to evolve. The Islamic Golden Age did not save ancient knowledge like a museum, it renovated it into a living house. Scholars translated, tested, corrected, refuted, and extended. Hospitals became teaching institutions, observatories became data factories, courts became debating halls. Across languages and faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and others, collaborators wrote the footnotes to one another's books. If Mesopotamia gave the ledger, Egypt the monument, Greece the method, Rome the institution, Persia the tolerance, and China the moral bureaucratic state, the Islamic world built a republic of letters that could ride a camel caravan or a riverboat. It proved that with paper, patronage, and patience, cities can become laboratories, and that light spreads fastest along roads and across languages.
The Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in history, not with monuments or ports, but with motion. On the Eurasian steppe, where wind and grass teach speed and endurance, they forged an army that converted mobility into strategy, logistics into power, and fear into diplomacy. Temujin, later honored as Genghis Khan, was born around the 1160s into a brittle world of rival clans, scarce pastures, and shifting alliances. His early life, captivity, escape, and patient coalition building taught him that loyalty must be rewarded, treachery punished, and merit recognized above lineage. By 1206, a great assembly, Kurultai, proclaimed him universal ruler of the Mongols. That date anchors the empire's beginning. Genghis reorganized society for war. He broke old tribal patronage and rebuilt the army on a decimal system, units of 10, Arban, 100, Jahun, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen. Commanders were promoted for ability. Aristocrats did not keep rank by birth alone. Every fighting man was also a logistician, carrying tools, bowstrings, dried meat, and spare clothing. Every unit practiced independent foraging and coordinated maneuvers. The weapon that made this speed matter was the reflex composite bow, wood, horn, and sinew layered to produce high draw weight and a flat trajectory even from horseback. A typical rider managed several remounts, changing horses mid-campaign to maintain pace. Coupled with stirrups and disciplined training, Mongol archers could feign retreat, wheel at a signal, and fire volleys into disordered pursuers. Surprise and deception were not tricks, they were doctrine. Against nomads, mobility wins.
Against walled cities, it usually fails. The Mongols solved the city problem by recruiting and protecting engineers. Chinese, Khitan, and later Muslim specialists traveled with the armies, building traction and counterweight trebuchets, siege towers, and sappers' tunnels. The empire grew by absorption. Conquer a place, enlist its skills, move those skills to the next frontier. The first great targets lay to the east. In the early 1210s, Genghis challenged the Jin dynasty in North China. Campaigns combined encirclement in the field with methodical sieges. Farther west, a diplomatic dispute with the Khwarezmian Empire escalated into full invasion 1219 to 1221 after a Mongol trade convoy was killed and Genghis's envoys executed. Cities such as Bukhara, Samarkand, and Gurganj fell. Resistance often triggered mass reprisals, while surrenderers could be spared and put to work. The speed of the campaign shocked contemporaries. Multiple tumens operated on converging lines, sharing intelligence through riders who could cover 100 kilometers in a day.
The Mongols also mastered reconnaissance. Subutai, among their greatest generals, led deep raids into the Caucasus and across the steppe. In 1223, at the Khalkha River, Mongol forces defeated a coalition of Rus princes and steppe allies by luring them into a long pursuit, then turning to crush them piecemeal. The point was not to hold ground, it was to measure enemies, routes, and responses. Genghis died in 1227 during the final stages of campaigning against the Tangut Shisha. He left a template rather than a will carved in stone. Sons and trusted generals would continue expansion. The imperial household would keep the core pasture lands. The civil administration, scribes, census takers, and tax collectors would be expanded alongside the army. Under Ogadei, elected Great Khan in 1229, the empire pressed outward. North China's Jin dynasty fell by 1234 after joint Mongol-Song pressure. In the west, Batu, Genghis's grandson, led armies into Eastern Europe 1236 to 1242, destroying Volga-Bulgar centers, subduing the Rus principalities, and defeating European coalitions at Legnica, Liegnitz, and Mohi on the Sayo. Just as pressure mounted toward Austria and perhaps beyond, word arrived of Ogadei's death, 1241 to 1242. The princes withdrew for a new succession, proof that Mongol politics could halt Mongol conquest. The empire's diplomatic nervous system was the Yam, a relay post system that stretched from Manchuria to the Black Sea. Way stations with fresh horses and supplies allowed official couriers to move with remarkable speed. Bronze or silver tablets, paisi, signaled their authority to claim fodder, shelter, and escorts. Information traveled almost as fast as fear. Administration kept pace with the cavalry. Conquered lands were assessed by census. Taxes could be collected as grain, livestock, cloth, or coin, and artisans were registered so their skills could be protected and mobilized. The famous Yasa, often described as Genghis's law code, survives not as a single definitive text, but as fragments and later references. Still, its spirit is plain: obedience, discipline, protection of envoys and merchants, and sharp penalties for theft or desertion. The empire privileged practical law over inherited custom when custom impeded order. The Mongol world rewarded merchants. Ortuk partnerships, state-backed investments, advanced capital to traders who moved goods under imperial protection. Caravanserais offered security and storage. Armed escorts reduced banditry. For the first time in centuries, a traveler could cross most of Eurasia under one overarching authority, the so-called Pax Mongolica. Diplomatic missions from the papacy and European kings, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine in the 1240s, William of Rubruck in the 1250s,
rode the same roads as Muslim scholars, Armenian envoys, and Central Asian traders. Later, Venetian accounts, like those attributed to Marco Polo, describe the Yuan court's routines, paper money, relays, and catalogs of stored grain. Religion was managed with the cool calculus of empire. Shamanist practices coexisted with Buddhism, Christianity, notably among some Mongol elites, and Islam in different parts of the realm. Toleration was policy, not sentiment. Priests, monks, and imams could be exempted from taxes. Temples and mosques were protected if their communities accepted Mongol rule. The price of pluralism was obedience. After a civil war among Genghis's descendants, Mongke became Great Khan in 1251 and authorized major operations. In the Middle East, Hulegu advanced with Chinese and Persian siege experts, eliminating the Nizari Ismaili strongholds in the 1250s and, in 1258, storming Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate as a political entity ended. Libraries and neighborhoods were destroyed. Survivors rebuilt a new religious and scholarly center in Cairo. The Mongol advance met its first clear defeat at Ain Jalut in 1260, when the Mamluks of Egypt used fast cavalry and disciplined counterattacks to halt a Mongol vanguard in Palestine. The message, even moving empires can be stopped by prepared, equally mobile foes.
Kublai, declared Great Khan in 1260, and later founder of the Yuan dynasty, proclaimed 1271, shifted the center of gravity to China. He adopted Chinese administrative structures, kept many Mongol privileges, and oversaw the long war against the southern Song, culminating in victory in 1279. The Yuan court used paper currency, jiao chao, a household registration system, and a hierarchy of ethnic categories. It staffed offices with a mix of Mongol, Central Asian, and Chinese officials. The empire at its East Asian apex was a fusion state, steppe mobility married to a sedentary bureaucracy. Not all campaigns succeeded. Fleets sent against Japan in 1274 and 1281 failed, one with the aid of typhoons remembered in Japan as divine winds, and both undermined by logistics, ship design, and stiff resistance. Expeditions into Dai Viet, Vietnam, and Java faced disease, climate, and guerrilla tactics. The Mongol system excelled on open ground. Tropical terrain eroded its advantages. By the late 13th century, the empire functioned as four major khanates: the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Iran and Iraq, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Pontic-Caspian steppe and the Rus lands. They acknowledged a theoretical unity, but succession disputes and local interests took priority. The Ilkhanate's conversion to Islam accelerated in the 1290s-1300s. The Golden Horde developed a Turkic Islamic court culture. The Chagatai realms swung between reform and fragmentation. The very roads that knit the empire also carried disease. In the mid-14th century, plague, likely Yersinia pestis, moved along trade corridors from Central Asia into the Middle East and Europe, causing demographic shocks that reshaped societies. The Mongols did not cause the Black Death, but the scale of their trade networks enabled its spread. Decline came not from one defeat, but from layered stresses: dynastic quarrels, fiscal strain, local elites resisting distant commands, and the limits of cavalry power against fortified, gunpowder-armed rivals. In China, the Yuan faced floods, famine, and rebellion. The Red Turban movements of the 1350s and 1360s gathered momentum, and in 1368, the Ming dynasty took Beijing. The Ilkhanate fractured in the 1330s after a succession crisis. The Golden Horde splintered under pressure from local princes and Tartar rivals.
Central Asia saw the rise of Timur, Tamerlane in the late 14th century, who both drew on and shattered Jinghisid legacies. Myths cling to Mongol history. One says they were merely destroyers, yet they built a continental courier network, standardized weights and measures in some regions, protected merchants, and resettled artisans rather than exterminating them when it served policy. Another myth inflates precise body counts. Sources attest to devastation in places, but reliable numbers are scarce. The sober truth is already stark. Cities fell, populations moved, and landscapes of power were remade. The Mongols' signature innovations were organizational. Merit-based promotion tied to a hard training regime, a modular army that could split and recombine at speed, strict protection of envoys and merchants to enable diplomacy and trade, intelligence networks that mapped rivers, forage, and wintering grounds, and a habit of borrowing technologies, from siege engines to scripts, without pride blocking utility. They turned ethnographic insight into advantage. They knew what horses could do, how grasslands recover, when to campaign in winter on frozen rivers, and how to make enemies move where they wanted them to go. The empire's cultural effects ran in both directions. Gunpowder recipes, paper money, printing techniques, and navigational knowledge circulated more widely. Artisans from Damascus, Aleppo, and Khwarizm worked in Yuan China. Chinese weavers and metalworkers appeared in Iran. Nestorian Christians and Tibetan Buddhists found patrons at different courts. The steppe and the city learned each other's languages, sometimes literally, as the Mongols adopted the Uyghur script for writing Mongolian. If earlier civilizations taught ledger, stone, debate, law, tolerance, and moral bureaucracy, the Mongols added a final ingredient: scale through speed. They proved that information superiority and logistics can conquer distances that masonry cannot. Their empire was a moving architecture of herds, remounts, couriers, and camps, capable of encircling kingdoms and then taxing them. And like all architectures, theirs weathered. When the center could no longer arbitrate succession, when revenues failed to keep couriers fed and garrisons loyal, and when local elites saw more to gain by hedging than obeying, motion slowed and the pieces drifted apart. Yet the roots remained. Markets, envoys, and ideas kept crossing Eurasia long after the last Kurultai adjourned. As we ride on to the next chapter, the Ottomans, who bridged continents for 6 centuries, remember what the Mongols taught the world: that a state can be a network before it becomes a place, and that power, once it learns to move, forces everyone else to move with it.
The Ottomans began at the edges, on the Byzantine frontier of northwestern Anatolia around 1300, and built, over 6 centuries, a state that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the Balkans to Arabia, and the Caucasus to North Africa. Their genius was not only conquest, it was administration, a way to braid diverse peoples into a single workable order. Tradition places the dynasty's start with Osman, r.c. 1299 to 1324, a frontier leader whose followers, Ghazis seeking plunder, land, and honor, pressed into Byzantine territory. His son, Orhan, took Bursa in 1326, making it the first durable Ottoman capital. From there, the frontier widened. In 1354, a foothold at Gallipoli opened the Balkans. By the late 14th century, Ottoman armies moved through Thrace and Macedonia, confronting Serbian and Hungarian coalitions. The new power announced itself at key moments: Kosovo in 1389 against a Balkan coalition, Nicopolis in 1396 against a European crusade. Yet expansion did not march in a straight line. In 1402, at Ankara, Timur's forces captured Sultan Bayezid I, and the Ottoman polity fractured in an interregnum. When Mehmet I rebuilt unity, are 1413 to 1421, the state had survived its first existential test. Resilience became policy. The hinge of world history turned in 1453. Mehmed II, remembered as Fatih, the conqueror, took Constantinople after a careful siege that combined massive artillery, naval coordination, and the exploitation of a breach in the Theodosian walls. The city, renamed Istanbul, became a cosmopolitan capital. Mehmed repopulated it with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, reorganized markets, converted Hagia Sophia into an imperial mosque, and made the palace complex a nerve center for law and finance. The Ottoman state mixed Islamic law, Sharia, with sultanic statutes, Kanun. The Sultan's council, the Divan, issued firmans, audited provincial governors, and oversaw the Timar system, which granted land revenues to cavalrymen, sipahi, in exchange for military service. In cities, guilds organized crafts and prices. In the countryside, tax registers measured fields and households with bureaucratic precision. The devshirme, periodic levies of Christian boys from the Balkans, fed the palace schools and the Janissary Corps. Converted to Islam and trained in discipline, language, and the arts of war, many rose to high office as administrators and commanders. The Janissaries, a standing infantry using gunpowder by the 15th century, became the Sultan's household troops. Over time, their privileges ossified and politicized, but at their peak, they were Europe's first professional infantry to integrate gunpowder at scale. Ottoman pluralism was administrative, not modern multiculturalism. The millet arrangement recognized religious communities, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, Jewish, and others, granting them authority over personal status law, schools, and charities, while taxes and security remained imperial. This did not make self-contained mini-states. It created a layered sovereignty, one ruler, many legal rooms inside the same house. Suleiman, 1520 to 1566, the Magnificent to Europeans, and the lawgiver, Kanuni, to his subjects, extended the empire's reach and regularized its rules. Belgrade fell in 1521, Rhodes in 1522. At Mohacs in 1526, the Hungarian army collapsed, opening Central Europe. An assault on Vienna in 1529 failed, but Ottoman pressure along the Habsburg frontier became a long rhythm of siege and counter-siege. To the east, campaigns against the Safavids contested Mesopotamia. To the south, Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, incorporated under Selim I, 1512 to 1520, gave the sultans custody of Islam's pilgrimage roads. At sea, a new theater emerged. With Corsair Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottoman fleet mastered the central Mediterranean. At Preveza in 1538, Ottoman galleys bested a Holy League fleet, securing decades of maritime dominance. Naval arsenals at Gallipoli and Istanbul turned forests into fleets. Shipwrights, caulkers, and rope makers made sea power an industrial project. Architecture gave this political order a skyline. Mimar Sinan, chief architect under Suleiman and his successors, refined the central domed mosque into a language of space. The Suleymaniye complex, inaugurated 1557, crowned the city with prayer halls, schools, hospitals, and kitchens funded by charitable endowments, Waqf. Later, the Selimiye Mosque at Edirne, completed 1575, pushed engineering and elegance to a summit. These were not only houses of worship, they were social infrastructures that fed the poor, taught the young, and employed craftsmen. The economy moved along roads, rivers, and sea lanes. Grain from the Black Sea and Egypt fed Istanbul. Caravans brought silk, wool, and dyes.
Coffee from Yemen and Arabia arrived in the 16th century, and coffee houses became hubs of news and debate, sometimes to the state's annoyance. Capitulations, commercial treaties with European powers, notably France in 1536, granted extraterritorial privileges to foreign merchants, entangling Ottoman markets with Mediterranean credit and law. The empire's apex in the 16th century faced new winds. Inflated silver from the New World washed into Europe and the Mediterranean, raising prices. The once elite Timar cavalry lagged behind infantry armed with modern firearms. Janissaries, once celibate barracks soldiers, married, ran shops, and resisted reforms. The Salali rebellions in Anatolia, late 16th, early 17th centuries, exposed rural distress and administrative overreach. Reform came through families and crises. The Kopruli viziers in the later 17th century imposed discipline at the center and pushed campaigns against Venice and Habsburgs. Crete's long war ended with the fall of Candia in 1669. Yet in 1683, the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna, led by Kara Mustafa Pasha, failed. A European Holy League counteroffensive followed. The Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699, forced the empire's first large-scale cessation of European territories, a psychological and strategic turning point.
The 18th century was not a simple decline. The Tulip period, 1718 to 1730, saw elite patronage of gardens, poetry, and architecture. Diplomatic missions to Paris and Vienna studied European artillery and fashions. And in 1727, Ibrahim Muteferiqa obtained permission to operate a printing press in Arabic script for non-religious works, slow at first, but symbolically significant. The Ottoman state remained a great power, negotiating with Russia, Austria, and Iran across multiple fronts. Modernization became urgent as the military balance shifted. Sultan Selim III, r. 1789 to 1807, launched the Nizam-i-Jadid, New Order, a reformed European drilled infantry with new barracks, uniforms, and artillery schools, financed by a separate treasury. Janissary resistance and court intrigue toppled the experiment, but the template lingered. Sultan Mahmud II, r. 1808 to 1839, completed the break. In 1826, the Janissary Corps was abolished in the Auspicious Incident, clearing space for a conscript uniformed army under central control. The Tanzimat, reordering 1839 to 1876, framed a broader state remodel. The 1839 Gulhane Edict promised security of life, honor, and property to all subjects. A new penal code, commercial courts, and provincial councils followed. The 1856 Reform Edict reiterated equal civic status for Muslims and non-Muslims. The 1864 provincial law reorganized provinces, vilayets, under appointed governors with councils to check them. Railways, telegraphs, and secular schools, engineers, doctors, administrators emerged as instruments of a modern bureaucracy. Empire, however, is negotiation as well as decree. Provincial notables, tax farmers, iltizam, and religious authorities bargained with the center. Debt crises in the 1870s brought European financial oversight, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, and nationalist movements moved through the Balkans. A constitution in 1876 convened a parliament, briefly suspended by Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1878, then restored after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. Competing visions, autocracy, constitutionalism, decentralized empire, contested the state's soul. War pried open seams. The Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, expelled the empire from most of Europe. Refugees flooded Anatolia. The army rearmed in a hurry.
In 1914, the empire entered the First World War on the side of the Central Powers. The Dardanelles campaign in 1915 to 1916 saw Ottoman troops hold Gallipoli against a major Allied amphibious assault at heavy cost, giving the empire one of its most famous defensive victories. On other fronts, the story was harsher. The Caucasus campaign collapsed into disaster. In the Arab provinces, the 1916 revolt, coordinated with British forces, undercut Ottoman control along the Hejaz Railway. During 1915, the government ordered mass deportations of Armenians from eastern Anatolia. Vast numbers perished through killings, starvation, and disease along the routes and in camps, an event widely recognized by historians as the Armenian Genocide. The war's end brought the Armistice of Mudros, October 1918, occupation of key territories, and the unraveling of imperial authority. After the war, resistance coalesced in Anatolia under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Between 1919 and 1922, the Turkish War of Independence defeated partition plans and Greek forces in western Anatolia. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922. The Republic of Turkey was proclaimed in 1923. The Caliphate, an office the sultans had claimed since the 16th century, was abolished in 1924. The Ottoman imperial story ended, but its institutional DNA persisted in successor states' law codes, bureaucracies, and cityscapes. What made the Ottoman Empire durable? 3 practices stand out. First, flexible incorporation. Frontier elites received land revenues and status in exchange for service. Urban guilds and religious endowments handled local welfare. Subject communities kept their rights while paying taxes and acknowledging the Sultan. Second, layered law. Sharia courts for personal status and morality. Qanun and commercial courts for administration and trade, and scribal bureaucracies that turned fields, ships, and shops into ledgers. Third, strategic geography. Control of the straits, caravan choke points, and grain routes made Istanbul a toll gate for 3 continents.
And what carried risk? Institutions that once innovated could fossilize, janissaries resisting change, tax farming squeezing peasants, capitulations inviting foreign leverage over customs and courts. The empire's strength in balancing many interests, court, ulema, guilds, notables, also slowed reform when rivals vetoed one another. Meanwhile, global shifts, oceanic trade bypassing eastern Mediterranean routes, European industrial production, and new military drills demanded faster adaptation than a consensus system could supply. Myths distract from the real lessons. The harem was not a palace of idle intrigue alone. It was part of a dynastic household with educational, charitable, and political dimensions. The millet system did not grant full political autonomy. It delegated personal law under imperial sovereignty. Janissaries were not an immutable slave guard. They were, at origin, a meritocratic infantry that later became a conservative lobby. Reality is more interesting than legend. The Ottomans were engineers of coexistence until the engineering fell behind the forces it had once mastered. The Ottoman Bridge did not merely connect east and west. It created a space where ideas and people crossed safely enough to matter. Andalusian exiles found refuge after 1492. Balkan architects and Persian calligraphers worked side by side. Cairo's scholars and Bosnian judges read the same legal texts. Greek shipowners and Armenian merchants financed fleets that hauled grain to feed Istanbul's poor. The bridge is visible in stone, but it lived in ledgers, docks, kitchens, courts, and classrooms. If Mesopotamia taught accounting, Egypt monumentalized kingship, Greece refined public argument, Rome scaled institutions, Persia organized diversity, China moralized bureaucracy, and the Islamic world built a network of learning. The Ottomans show how to keep a multi-ethnic empire working for centuries, reward service, route grain, write clear law, and let many communities breathe under one roof, then keep reforming when the winds change. As we move next to the British Empire, the global oceanic archipelago on which the sun never sets, carry forward the Ottoman lesson. Geography can make you a bridge, but only policy keeps the bridge standing. When the tolls no longer pay for the repairs, and when the traffic finds new roads, even the strongest arches crack. The British Empire grew from a maritime bet that sea power, finance, and law could reach farther, faster, and cheaper than any land army. From the 17th to the mid-20th century, that bet held, long enough to tie together peoples and markets on every continent, and to leave institutions that still structure global life. Its first chapters unfolded in the Atlantic. In the 1600s, English colonies took root in North America and the Caribbean. Joint stock companies, chartered by the Crown, raised capital and shared risk. The Virginia Company tried tobacco. The Royal African Company trafficked enslaved Africans, and West Indian sugar estates yoked land, labor, and credit into profit. The triangular trade moved textiles and guns to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and sugar, tobacco, and later cotton to Europe. The empire began as ledger entries and manifests. The legal shell mattered. Admiralty courts, marine insurance from Lloyd's Coffee House, and a navy that could protect convoys turned private ventures into a system. Navigation acts channeled colonial trade through English ports. Customs officials and naval patrols tried, imperfectly, to enforce them. The Crown delegated, then audited, then tightened control when revenue or strategy demanded. War was the empire's midwife. In the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Britain and its allies fought France on multiple fronts. British arms and colonial militias seized Canada. The Royal Navy dominated seas. Victory brought vast territory and bills to pay. Taxes meant to fund imperial defense stoked protest in the 13 colonies. In 1776, those colonies declared independence. By 1783, the new United States stood outside Britain's rule. Setback did not end the project, it redirected it. The pivot was east. The East India Company, EIC, founded in 1600, had long traded in textiles, tea, and spices. By the mid-18th century, its private armies and alliances pulled it into politics. After the 1757 Battle of Plassey and subsequent victories, the company gained revenue rights in Bengal, 1765. Profit and famine coexisted. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed large numbers amid revenue pressures and market disruptions. Parliament, alarmed by corruption and risk, passed regulatory acts. Warren Hastings faced impeachment, and the state's hand tightened over the company. Company rule ended after the Great Uprising of 1857 to 1858, sparked by grievances over pay, land, and religious offense, and fueled by broader discontent with annexations and reforms. The British suppressed the revolt with brutal reprisals. In 1858, the Crown abolished the EIC's governance. India became a formal colony under a viceroy. Railways, telegraphs, and a codified legal system expanded. Universities opened at Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, 1857. The Indian civil service recruited by competitive exam, though barriers preserved British dominance for decades. The Raj was infrastructure plus hierarchy. The Industrial Revolution gave Britain new reach. Coal, steam engines, and mechanized spinning and weaving multiplied output. The Royal Navy, iron-hulled ships, and global coaling stations created a high-speed postal and passenger network.
London's capital markets financed railways and ports worldwide. Sterling bills of exchange greased trade. Free trade doctrine, adopted after the repeal of the Corn Laws, 1846, turned the empire into a global warehouse. Raw materials in, manufactures out, services and insurance in between. Coercion and treaty ran together. In China, the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, forced treaty ports and ceded Hong Kong to Britain. Most favored nation clauses widened access for British merchants. In the Middle East, the 1869 Suez Canal transformed routes to India. British interest turned to control. In 1882, after unrest in Egypt, British troops occupied the country, securing the canal while nominal Ottoman sovereignty lingered. The scramble for Africa accelerated in the 1880s and 1990s as European powers drew borders with scant regard for older polities. Britain claimed Egypt and Sudan, East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, parts of Southern Africa, and West African territories like the Gold Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria. Expansion mixed private enterprise and imperial rivalry, gold and diamonds in South Africa, missionary networks, and strategic rail links. The Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, against the South African Republic and Orange Free State brought scorched earth tactics and concentration camps that caused high civilian mortality. Victory consolidated British power, but left a deep, racialized politics that would harden into apartheid under a later independent South African state. Not all colonies were alike. White settler dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and later South Africa, gained responsible government in the 19th century and dominion status in 1907 to 1931, managing their own affairs while aligning defense and foreign policy with Britain. Tropical colonies were administered by governors, district officers, and indirect rule through local chiefs, especially in Africa under theorists like Frederick Lugard. The rhetoric praised trusteeship. The reality mixed road building and schools with extraction and constrained political rights. Culture and law traveled with soldiers and steamers. English became a lingua franca in administration and trade. Common law procedures governed contracts and courts. Civil services, censuses, and cadastral surveys mapped people and property. Mission schools and colonial universities educated local elites who would later lead nationalist movements. The empire made critics inside itself.
The First World War, 1914 to 1918, turned the empire into a war machine. Troops, laborers, and resources flowed from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to European and Middle Eastern fronts. The Gallipoli campaign scarred Australia and New Zealand. Battles on the Western Front and in East Africa stretched supply lines. After victory, Britain gained League of Nations mandates over former German and Ottoman lands, Iraq, Transjordan, Palestine, Tanganyika, and parts of Cameroon and Togo. Mandates were framed as tutelage. They were also strategic. Interwar contradictions sharpened. In India, the Amritsar or Jallianwala Bagh massacre, 1919, shocked opinion. Gandhi's non-cooperation and civil disobedience mobilized millions. Constitutional reforms granted councils, but not decisive power. In the Middle East, conflicting wartime promises to Arabs, McMahon-Hussein correspondence, and to Zionists, Balfour Declaration, collided in the British mandate for Palestine, sowing tensions that Britain could not resolve. Economic shocks, from the Great Depression to commodity price collapses, exposed colonial dependence on metropolitan markets. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, drained Britain's finances and sped decolonization. Again, the empire fought. Indian, African, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand forces served in North Africa, Europe, and Asia. Japan's swift conquests in 1941 to 1942 shattered the myth of European invincibility. The fall of Singapore, 1942, reverberated across Asia. After 1945, Britain faced deaths, rebuilding, and rising nationalisms it no longer had the resources or legitimacy to suppress. The unraveling was fast. In 1947, British India was partitioned into India and Pakistan. Communal violence killed large numbers and displaced millions. In 1948, Ceylon or Sri Lanka and Burma or Myanmar became independent. In the same year, Britain ended its mandate in Palestine. The State of Israel was declared. War followed, and Britain exited a conflict it could not arbitrate. In Africa, independence moved in waves. Ghana in 1957, then Nigeria in 1960, then East Africa and others through the 1960s. Settler conflicts in Kenya, the Mau Mau insurgency, and Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe, revealed how violent decolonization could be. In Southeast Asia, Malaya navigated emergency and insurgency to independence, 1957, later forming Malaysia, 1963, without Singapore, independent, 1965. The last large colonial transfer came with the 1997 handover of Hong Kong to China under a one-country, two-systems framework. Suez, 1956, was the strategic reckoning. When Egypt nationalized the canal, Britain and France, coordinating with Israel, launched a military operation. They won on the ground and lost in diplomacy. U.S. and international pressure forced withdrawal. The episode announced that Britain could no longer act as a global imperial arbiter without American consent. The sun was setting, and policy adapted. NATO, European cooperation, and a reimagined Commonwealth replaced direct rule.
Myths endure. History corrects. The empire did not spread civilization as a singular gift. It redistributed power, sometimes building courts and railways that locals used and adapted, sometimes crushing resistance and privileged settlers. Abolition mattered. Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in its colonies in the 1830s, but emancipation followed centuries of profits built on slavery's violence and compensated owners rather than the enslaved. Railways in India transformed mobility and markets, yet were designed with strategic logistics in mind and financed on terms that burdened colonial revenues. Empire mixed uplift and extraction, reform and coercion, in proportions set in London, Calcutta, Cairo, or Nairobi, and contested everywhere. Why did the system last as long as it did? Three levers reinforced each other. First, sea power, dockyards, coaling stations, and a navy able to concentrate strength at distant points. Second, finance and law. London's capital, insurance, and courts made long-distance risk calculable. Contracts were enforceable across oceans. Third, intermediaries, colonial elites, commercial houses, and local soldiers, sepoys, askaris, Gurkhas, who made imperial orders practical. When any lever failed, naval supremacy challenged, credit strained, or intermediaries defected, the structure shook. Why did it end? The costs of 2 world wars, the rise of American and Soviet power, anti-colonial movements with mass support and international allies, and the moral and political cost of ruling without consent. Technology helped, too. Radio and railways that once projected British authority carried speeches, newspapers, and organizers who built national coalitions.
The empire's afterlife is institutional rather than territorial. Parliamentary forms, common law, civil services, and English language education shape politics from the Caribbean to South Asia and Africa. The Commonwealth of Nations, voluntary and uneven, hosts sport, scholarships, and sometimes quiet diplomacy. Migration created diasporas. South Asians, Afro-Caribbeans, Africans, and others reshaped British cities after 1948's Windrush and later waves. British citizens settled across former dominions. The exchange runs two ways now. Food, music, literature, and law move in circles wider than any imperial map. If earlier powers taught accounting, stone, debate, law, tolerance, moral bureaucracy, and scholarly networks, and if the Mongols taught scale through motion, the British contribution was the oceanic infrastructure of the modern world, standardized time and telegraph cables, maritime insurance and bills of lading, global news wires, and a legal financial architecture that made world trade routine. It worked until it didn't, until nations demanded to be principals, not clients. As we turn next to lessons from the fall, keep the British story in view. An empire built less on fortresses than on contracts and coal, undone not by a single defeat, but by arithmetic, of costs, of consent, and of a world that learned to use Britain's own tools to insist on independence.
Empires do not fall for one reason. They fail like ecosystems when several stresses, each survivable alone, align. Look across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, China, the Islamic world, the Mongols, the Ottomans, and the British, and the same themes recur. Finances run ahead of revenue, logistics falter, legitimacy thins, elites quarrel, enemies learn, and the climate or disease nudges a stressed system over the edge. Start with logistics. Mesopotamian city-states rose on canals and granaries. When salinization reduced yields or irrigation works fell into disrepair, tax in grain shrank. Soldiers went unpaid, and rivals pounced. Rome's Annona fed a metropolis only so long as ships arrived from Egypt and North Africa. When war or mismanagement cut roots and coinage debased, prices spiked, and faith in the center eroded. The Ottoman heart beat with Black Sea and Egyptian grain. The English web relied on coal, coaling stations, and the Suez. Supply is sovereignty. Overexpansion is a lure with interest charges. Athens turned league into empire, then found that fleets and tribute bought enemies as well as marble. Rome's borders lengthened faster than its methods to pay legions. Crises in the 3rd century exposed how thin the line between security and insolvency can be. Mongol tumans could be everywhere until winter forage, remounts, and succession calendars said otherwise. Strategy that ignores maintenance becomes spectacle. Succession is the quiet hinge. Egyptian kings legitimized rule with ma'at, but succession struggles in intermediate periods opened doors to provincial strongmen. Roman civil wars from Marius and Sulla to Caesar and Antony show how armies loyal to men rather than offices end republics. The Mongol Kurultai system rewarded consensus until it deadlocked. Princes raced home to elect a great Khan, while campaigns stalled. Ottoman janissaries and palace factions could crown or depose. The British system, anchored in parliamentary continuity, proved steadier domestically, but its imperial outposts still felt the tremors of decisions made far away.
Legitimacy needs a language and feedback loops. Zhao thinkers framed the mandate of heaven: govern well or lose the right to rule. That idea taught rulers to read floods,
famines, and prices as moral audits. When the court silenced remonstrance, dynastic time shortened. Islamic jurists and scholars critiqued rulers with law and ethics. When courts funded learning and welfare, cities trusted. When oppression rose, the learned withdrew or resisted. Ottoman sultans balanced Sharia and Qanun. When tax farmers squeezed and justice seemed arbitrary, revolt followed. Elites can either transmit policy or trap it. Persian satraps worked because inspectors, the king's eyes, rode the roads. When oversight lapsed, satrapies drifted. In Rome, municipal elites sustained the imperial facade in the provinces. As benefits fell and burdens rose, they hid wealth or sought local patrons. In the British case, colonial intermediaries, landlords, merchants, soldiers, could stabilize rule. Yet the same schools and courts that trained them also armed them with the tools to demand independence. Capacity without accountability curdles into capture. Innovation is a tide. States drown if they face it with sandbags. Greek hoplite warfare yielded to naval tactics. Those who adapted, Athens at Salamis, survived the day. Gunpowder changed Eurasia. Ottomans, who pioneered artillery supremacy in the 15th–16th centuries, later faced European drill and industry that outpaced their institutions. The Mongols borrowed siegecraft and paper money, but stumbled at sea and in jungles. Britain built a telegraph empire and a steam navy. Then wireless, air power, and armored warfare bent the cost curve of control, while anti-colonial movements used the same communications to organize faster than old colonial policing could respond. Finance is the bloodstream. Rome's silver denarius lost content as expenses rose, inviting inflation and barter. Emperors tried edicts when trust failed. The Abbasid court glittered on revenues that depended on provincial tax farmers. When war and politics disrupted remittances, brilliant cities dimmed. Ottomans faced a price revolution as New World silver flooded markets. Military pay and provisioning strained. Britain's imperial arithmetic finally broke in the age of total war, debt, rebuilding, and the cost of garrisoning a world that no longer consented. Diversity is an asset, if managed. Achaemenid Persia thrived by respecting local laws and cults, using Aramaic as an administrative bridge and roads as arteries. When tolerance slipped, rebellions rose. The Ottoman millet framework allowed religious communities to handle personal law within imperial sovereignty, buying loyalty with recognition. When external powers used protection to intrude and internal reform lagged, the mechanism jammed. Rome extended citizenship widely by 212 CE, turning conquered peoples into stakeholders. Yet citizenship without equitable burden sharing breeds cynicism.
Information speed is power. Persian couriers crossed satrapies on the royal road. Roman milestones and post stations shrank time. Mongol yam relays let orders outrun rumor. British undersea cables made London the hub of world news. When the flow reversed, when provincial realities reached the capital too slowly or leaders ignored reports, policy lagged and legitimacy bled. The late Qing learned that rebellions can ride the same rails as tax grain. The British learned that newspapers and radio made Amritsar, Suez, and Mau Mau global scandals, not local crises. Environment and disease are multipliers, not single causes. Nile failures stressed Egypt's compact with the gods. Over-irrigation salted Mesopotamian fields. Droughts and cold snaps pushed nomads into agrarian worlds with force. Plagues, Antonine, Justinianic, Black Death, reduced taxpayers and soldiers, raising wages and lowering rents, unbalancing old contracts. The Mongol routes that eased trade also eased pandemic spread.
Empires that diversified food sources, maintained stores, and adjusted taxes in bad years earned time. Those that taxed as if the weather obeyed decrees lost it. Culture can harden from compass into cage. The exam system once refreshed China with talent. Centuries later, rote learning crowded out problem solving, and reform lagged until the crises of the 19th century forced abolition. Janissaries were once a meritocratic corps. By the 18th century, they were a veto coalition. The British believed in free trade as civilizational glue. When markets turned political and strategic, doctrine masked dependency and provoked blowback. Institutions must remember why they were created, or they become obstacles to their own purpose. Violence's signal declines. Early conquests terrify. Assyrian displays, Mongol reprisals, Roman triumphs. But enemies learn. Mamluks countered Mongol cavalry at Ain Jalut by matching mobility. European coalitions met Ottoman siegecraft with trace Italian forts and disciplined musketry. Colonial insurgents used small units, local knowledge, and political messaging to make the empire expensive. Deterrence must be refreshed with competence and reform. Fear alone depreciates. Myths of sudden collapse mislead. Western Rome did not end in a night. Tax arrangements, law, and bishops' courts bridged into successor kingdoms. Abbasid learning moved to Cairo, Tabriz, and Samarkand after 1258. Ottoman courts and cadasters informed republican bureaucracies. The British Empire dissolved into a commonwealth where law, sport, and migration replaced viceroys. Endings are edits, not erasures. So what keeps polities resilient? First, maintenance. Canals dredged, roads repaired, archives audited, prices watched. Han granaries, Ottoman Waqf kitchens, and British lighthouse funds reveal the same principle. Routine care beats glory. Second, feedback. Credible courts, honest censuses, protected messengers, and tolerated critics. From Confucian remonstrance to parliamentary committees, systems that listen last. Third, modularity. Rome's municipalities, Persia's satrapies, Britain's dominions, units that can act locally within a shared rule set. Fourth, adaptability. Adopt useful tools from rivals, Athenian triremes, Ottoman artillery, Qing arsenals, Japanese Meiji reforms, before circumstance forces it at higher cost. And what signals warn of stress? When coinage is clipped and soldiers paid late. When petitions go unanswered and officials punish the messenger. When irrigation gates stick and the tax bill does not. When elite sons study prestige rather than problems. When the center hoards symbols and neglects systems. History's alarms are mundane. Leadership style matters, but only within structure. Augustus stabilized by hiding monarchy inside republican offices. Diocletian professionalized crisis management. Suleiman regularized law. Akbar in India, beyond our core list, integrated elites by flexible ritual. Great rulers buy time, institutions spend or invest it. When successors treat prudence as optional, time runs out. Ethics and empire are not opposites, they are prerequisites. Persian truth, Asha, Egyptian Ma'at, Confucian benevolence, Islamic Hispa, Roman civic virtue, British rule of law rhetoric, each supplied a public yardstick. Hypocrisy corrodes faster under a standard than under cynicism, yet the presence of a standard also enables renewal. When rules are openly broken by rulers, subjects do not forget. The biggest meta lesson is humble. Complexity beats cleverness. Empires that believed a single lever, fear, gold, fleets, or ideology could control a world eventually met a problem that lever could not move. Those that combined levers, law with logistics, pluralism with performance audits, innovation with inheritance, bought centuries. For a boring history channel meant to soothe, here is the calm truth. Falls are slow, repairs are slower, and the work that prevents collapse looks like nothing until it stops. The cuneiform tally, the nilometer reading, the satrap's audit, the Roman road survey, the Chinese memorial, the Waqf kitchen ledger, the Mongol courier's schedule, the Ottoman cadastral page, the British lighthouse inspector's log. These are the stitches that hold a vast fabric. As we move to the conclusion, keep one image in mind, a bridge. Some stones are ancient, some newly set. Water rises and falls, travelers change. The bridge stands not because of destiny, but because someone inspects the joints, patches the mortar, and lets traffic pass in rules that all can bear. That is the real lesson from the rise and fall of empires. Endurance belongs to systems that remember to mend.
We have walked a long arc, from the clay of Uruk to the stone of Giza, the arguments of Athens to the roads of Rome, from Persia's relay posts to China's examination halls, from Baghdad's observatories to riders on the steppe, from Ottoman courts to British cables. Each empire rose on tools it could maintain and fell when those tools dulled faster than they could be sharpened. The thread is practical, not mystical. Mesopotamia taught record-keeping, Egypt durable authority, Greece public reasoning, Rome scalable institutions, Persia rule through recognition of difference, China moralized administration, the Islamic world translation and experiment, the Mongols speed and logistics, the Ottomans layered law for many peoples, the British oceanic finance and communications. Later states borrowed, combined, and edited these methods. Patterns recur. Expansion outruns revenue. Armies loyal to commanders, not offices, tilt states into civil war. Climate shocks and disease expose brittle budgets. Elites capture institutions designed to restrain them. Rulers ignore messengers who bring bad news. None of this is destiny. It is maintenance deferred. Legitimacy always had a language. The Zhou Mandate warned that floods and famine are audits of rule. Roman law promised predictable procedure. Islamic hisba policed fair weights and public welfare. Ottoman Kanun complemented sacred law. British rule of law ideals bound contracts across seas. When practice matched principle, trust accumulated. When it did not, memory sharpened. Logistics made sovereignty visible. Canals dredged in Han China, aqueducts arcing toward Rome, the Persian royal road, the Mongol yam, Ottoman grain fleets, and British coaling stations, all were quiet guarantees that promises would arrive on time. When the grain didn't, when the post went missing, when the pay was late, people judged the state more than the storm. Innovation favored the adaptable. Triremes at Salamis, gunpowder at Chaldiran and Constantinople, printing presses in Istanbul, steam and telegraph in Victorian docks. Useful tools rarely care who invents them. Empires that learned from rivals bought decades. Those that mocked the lesson paid sooner. Endings were edits, not erasures. Western Rome's law outlived the Forum. Abbasid sciences moved to Cairo, Tabriz, and Samarkand. Ottoman cadasters and courts informed new republics. The British imperial web reknit as a commonwealth and a global economy. Ruins are dramatic. Continuities are consequential. What remains for us is modest and demanding. Keep ledgers honest. Let critics speak without fear.
repair canals, roads, and data systems before parades, recruit by merit and rotate power, tax with realism in bad years, reward service more than slogans. These are ancient instructions. They are also tomorrow's. The single thread through time is not glory, it is upkeep. A city that feeds its people, a court that hears the weak, a school that teaches method, a road that endures winter. These are the empires that last, whether they rule a valley, a continent, or a network of screens. As we close, breathe with the past, clay cooling, stone settling, water moving in channels, hooves fading on the horizon, the lighthouse beam sweeping another circle. History's lesson is quiet and exacting. Power is a craft. Mend what you build, and time will remember you kindly.